The night air beside the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had disappeared beyond the western desert. Soft wind moved slowly across the dark water, carrying the smell of wet mud, reeds, fish, and distant cooking fires. Along the riverbanks, small lamps flickered inside mud brick homes where tired workers were settling into another quiet night in ancient Egypt. Far away from the temples of kings and the bright walls of palaces, ordinary people rested their aching bodies after long days beneath the heavy sun. Their lives moved slowly with the rhythm of the river. Morning came with birdsong and dusty light. Evening arrived with silence, smoke from clay ovens, and the sound of sandals dragging softly across worn stone floors. For poor Egyptians, food was never a grand thing. Meals were simple, plain, and repeated day after day. Yet those meals carried entire lives within them. Bread shaped by rough hands before sunrise. Thin beer poured into clay cups after hours of labor. Onions hanging from cords inside dark homes. Fish drying beneath the heat. Lentils simmering slowly in blackened pots while children slept nearby on woven reed mats. The simple diet of poor Egyptians was tied closely to the earth itself. To the flooding river. To the dusty fields. To the tired muscles of farmers and fishermen. To the women who rose before dawn to grind grain by hand while the world outside remained blue with early morning darkness. In the quiet hours before sunrise, many homes were already awake. Inside one small village south of Memphis, a woman sat beside a grinding stone while a tiny oil lamp glowed beside her elbow. The room was close and warm. The walls were made from dried mud brick, cracked slightly from years of heat. A sleeping child shifted softly beneath a linen cloth in the corner while the woman pushed grain back and forth across the grinding stone with slow steady movement. The sound was soft and rough. Stone against grain. Stone against stone. Again and again. Her shoulders ached from yesterday's work, but the bread needed to be ready before the men walked toward the fields. The grain dust clung to her arms and settled into the lines of her fingers. Sometimes the work began before the stars faded. Sometimes it continued long after darkness returned. Most poor Egyptians ate bread every single day of their lives. Bread was not simply part of a meal. It was the center of survival itself. Workers carried loaves wrapped in cloth as they traveled to fields, workshops, riverboats, and construction sites. Children tore pieces from hard crusts while sitting in shaded alleyways. Old men softened stale bread in water before eating slowly with worn teeth. The grain used for bread usually came from barley or emmer wheat. After the Nile floods retreated each year, farmers planted seeds in the dark wet soil left behind by the river. The earth near the Nile was rich and black, very different from the endless pale desert beyond the fields. Yet farming was never easy. The heat arrived early. By midday, the air could feel heavy enough to press against the chest. Men bent over fields with simple wooden tools while sweat rolled down their backs beneath rough linen clothing. Sand stuck to their feet. Insects gathered near wet irrigation ditches. Sometimes the river flooded too much. Sometimes not enough. Still, the grain had to grow. Without grain, there was no bread. Without bread, there was little else. As dawn slowly spread across the land, workers often ate their first meal quickly and without ceremony. A piece of coarse bread. Perhaps onions or garlic. Maybe a few dates if the family had enough. Sometimes a cup of weak beer remained from the night before. Egyptian beer was not like the cold clear drink imagined by people far in the future. It was thick and cloudy. More like a heavy grain drink than modern beer. Small bits of grain floated inside it. It carried nourishment as much as comfort. Even children drank watered forms of it because clean water was not always easy to store safely in the heat. The beer was filling, warm, sour at times, but it helped tired workers continue through long days. In many villages, the smell of baking bread drifted through the narrow streets during early morning hours. Clay ovens radiated heat into already warm homes. Smoke curled slowly upward into pale skies. Dogs wandered beside doorways searching for scraps. Donkeys stamped their feet impatiently while waiting to carry loads toward the markets. The streets themselves were dusty and uneven. Sand gathered in corners beside broken pottery and bundles of reeds. Children ran barefoot through the lanes while older women carried water jars balanced carefully upon their heads. Most poor families owned very little. Their meals reflected this simplicity. Rich meats rarely appeared except during festivals, religious celebrations, or unusual moments of luck. For many workers, meat was something smelled more often than tasted. Fish, however, could sometimes be gathered from the Nile. At sunrise, fishermen pushed small wooden boats through quiet water while mist hovered low above the river surface. Reeds brushed softly against the boats as nets slipped into the water. The river gave life to nearly every part of Egyptian existence. It fed fields. It carried trade. It cooled hot skin. It provided fish for those fortunate enough to catch them. Some fish were eaten fresh after cooking over small fires. Others were salted and dried beneath the sun for later use. The smell of drying fish lingered heavily near poorer fishing villages, mixing with mud, smoke, and river water. A fisherman returning home after dawn might carry only a few small fish in woven baskets. Still, even this modest catch could bring relief to a hungry household. Inside simple homes, cooking remained slow and physical. Grain had to be ground. Dough kneaded by hand. Water carried from wells or the river. Fuel gathered carefully because wood was precious in many parts of Egypt. Dried animal dung often burned inside cooking fires, creating smoke that clung to ceilings and clothing. The labor surrounding food never truly ended. Women spent countless hours preparing meals from basic ingredients. Their hands hardened from grinding grain and carrying heavy jars. Smoke irritated their eyes. Heat surrounded them constantly. Yet meals remained plain despite all this work. Bread, beer, onions, lentils, dates, sometimes fish, occasionally figs. A little oil when available. This was the quiet foundation beneath the lives of countless Egyptians. As the sun climbed higher, labor across the land became slower and heavier. Farmers wiped sweat from their faces with rough cloths. Stone workers paused briefly in narrow patches of shade. Scribes sitting cross-legged inside workshops dipped reed pens carefully into ink while trying to avoid the worst heat of the afternoon. Even scribes, whose lives were easier than laborers, often lived on simple meals. Their food might be slightly better or more varied, but Egypt remained a land where grain shaped daily existence for rich and poor alike. At construction sites near growing cities, workers sat together during brief rest periods holding rough loaves in dusty hands. Their skin darkened beneath years of sun. Their shoulders carried marks from stone blocks and heavy baskets. They spoke quietly while chewing slowly. Some workers dipped bread into oil or crushed beans. Others simply ate dry bread alone. There was little time for comfort during work hours. The heat pressed down endlessly. Far above them, vultures circled in pale skies. Nearby, supervisors watched carefully while recording supplies and labor counts upon rolls of papyrus. Yet even in exhaustion, meals created small moments of stillness. A laborer sitting against a wall with bread and beer beside friends could briefly forget the ache in his back. A mother sharing dates with children during evening shade could feel a small softness within the hard rhythm of survival. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, marketplaces became crowded with movement and noise. Merchants arranged vegetables upon woven mats while flies buzzed lazily through the warm air. Donkeys passed through narrow streets carrying sacks of grain. Potters displayed clay jars darkened by kill smoke. Fishermen called out prices near baskets of fresh catch. Poor families walked carefully through these markets, often carrying very little to trade. Some exchanged labor for food. Others traded woven goods, baskets, fishhooks, or simple household items. Many could not afford spices or fine foods from distant lands. Cinnamon, imported oils, honey, and delicate fruits belonged mostly to wealthier households and temple kitchens. Poor Egyptians lived close to necessity. Still, even humble foods carried comfort. Fresh bread pulled from an oven filled homes with warmth. A ripe fig eaten slowly beneath evening shade could feel deeply satisfying after hours of labor. Cool water drawn from clay jars soothed dry throats coated with dust. As darkness approached, villages softened into quieter rhythms. Workers returned home with slow heavy steps. Sandals scraped against packed earth roads. Cattle settled near simple shelters. The last orange light faded across the Nile while birds disappeared into reeds along the riverbanks. Inside homes, evening meals were often the largest of the day, though still modest. Families gathered close together on reed mats. Clay bowls passed from hand to hand. Oil lamps flickered gently against mud walls. Children ate sleepily beside exhausted parents. The room smelled of warm grain and smoke. Outside, distant voices drifted through narrow streets before fading slowly into silence. For poor Egyptians, hunger was never far away. Years of poor flooding could damage crops badly. Grain shortages brought fear into entire communities. Bread became smaller. Beer thinner. Families stretched food carefully while hoping the Nile would rise properly the following season. The river controlled nearly everything. Its flooding brought life, but also uncertainty. When the waters rose each year, fields disappeared beneath wide stretches of muddy water. Farmers waited patiently during the season, repairing tools, mending homes, fishing, or working on state building projects. Then, once the waters retreated, planting began again. The cycle repeated endlessly across generations. Children grew watching their parents grind grain before dawn. Young boys learned fishing routes along the Nile. Girls learned bread making beside smoky ovens. Old people sat quietly in doorways chewing slowly while evening wind moved through village streets. Life was difficult, but its routines were deeply familiar. At night, many poor Egyptians slept upon simple reed mats laid directly on packed earth floors. Linen cloths covered tired bodies lightly against the warmth. Mosquitoes hummed softly in darkness. Nearby animals shifted occasionally outside. Sometimes hunger remained present even at bedtime. A child might sleep after only bread and watered beer. A laborer might lie awake briefly feeling the dull ache of an empty stomach after a particularly hard season. Yet exhaustion usually overcame discomfort quickly. The body surrendered to sleep after endless labor beneath the Egyptian sun. And so night settled softly over the villages beside the Nile. Moonlight touched quiet water. Palm trees swayed gently in warm darkness. Inside thousands of small mud brick homes, ordinary people rested beside the simple foods that shaped their lives. Bread cooling near ovens. Fish hanging to dry. Clay jars filled with grain. The faint smell of onions. The last glow of dying firelight. And somewhere beyond the sleeping villages, the Nile continued flowing slowly through the ancient land, carrying water, silence, and life through another quiet Egyptian night. Before the first light appeared above the eastern horizon, the villages beside the Nile were already beginning to stir once again. Darkness still rested over the fields, and the river looked almost black beneath the fading stars. Only a few scattered lamps glowed behind small windows cut into mud brick walls. The air felt cooler during these quiet hours before dawn. For a little while, the heavy heat of Egypt loosened its grip. A faint breeze moved across the water and slipped softly through narrow village streets where sleeping dogs lay curled beside doorways. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey gave a tired cry. Then silence returned once more. Inside one small house near the edge of the riverbank, a farmer slowly opened his eyes. His body was stiff from years of labor. His shoulders ached even before the day had begun. Beside him, his wife still slept lightly beneath a linen cloth while two children rested nearby on woven reed mats. The farmer sat quietly for a moment, listening. He could hear the soft crackle of dying embers from last night's fire. He could hear the wind outside brushing against dry reeds near the river. He could smell dust, smoke, and grain lingering in the darkness of the room. Then, slowly, he stood. His feet touched the cool packed earth floor. Another day had begun. In poor Egyptian homes, mornings often arrived without words. There was little energy for conversation before sunrise. People moved through familiar routines almost silently, guided by memory and necessity. The farmer's wife soon rose beside the grinding stone once again. Her hands already knew the motion before her mind fully woke. Grain was poured carefully onto the flat stone surface. Then came the slow sound repeated across Egypt every morning for thousands of years. Stone against grain. Stone against stone. Soft. Endless. The work demanded strength from the arms, shoulders, and back. Women spent enormous parts of their lives grinding flour this way. Fine dust coated their skin and drifted through the air inside cramped homes. Tiny particles settled into hair, clothing, and lungs. Yet bread could not exist without this labor. Even before sunrise, food preparation had already begun shaping the day. Outside, the sky slowly changed from black to deep blue. Along the riverbank, fishermen untied small boats from wooden posts driven into the mud. Water lapped quietly against the hulls while nets lay piled in damp heaps nearby. Many fishermen belonged to poor households that depended almost entirely on the river's generosity. Their meals changed with the success or failure of each catch. Some mornings brought baskets heavy with fish. Other mornings brought almost nothing at all. The Nile could feed a family, or leave them hungry. As dawn spread wider, more sounds appeared across the village. Sandals scraping against stone. Clay jars being lifted. Low voices drifting through narrow streets. Coughing from smoky homes. Roosters calling into the pale morning light. Children woke slowly. Some rubbed sleep from their eyes while chewing pieces of leftover bread from the night before. Others carried water jars beside older sisters or mothers. Even young children understood work early in life. Survival required many hands. Near the ovens, women shaped rough dough into flat loaves while small fires crackled beneath clay chambers blackened by years of smoke. The heat from the ovens mixed quickly with the warming air outside. The smell of baking bread slowly filled the village. Warm. Earthy. Comforting. Yet even fresh bread was often coarse and heavy. Tiny fragments of stone from grinding sometimes remained mixed within the flour, slowly wearing down teeth over many years. Archaeologists in distant futures would discover Egyptian skeletons with severe tooth damage caused partly by this daily bread. But the people themselves rarely thought about such things. Bread was life. It filled the stomach enough to continue working beneath the sun. That was enough. As the morning brightened fully, long lines of workers began moving toward the fields beyond the village. Some carried wooden hoes across their shoulders. Others balanced baskets or tools made from worn wood and copper. Dust rose softly beneath their feet as they walked together through narrow paths beside irrigation channels. The fields near the Nile looked green during growing seasons, but the work there remained exhausting. Mud clung heavily to legs and sandals. The sun reflected brightly from standing water. Insects hovered constantly near wet ground. Farmers bent for hours planting, digging, clearing weeds, or guiding water into dry soil. Their meals during work were simple and practical. A laborer might carry several small loaves wrapped in linen cloth along with onions or garlic tied together with cord. Sometimes dried fish provided extra nourishment. A clay jar of beer or water traveled beside them whenever possible. Meals were often eaten quickly while crouching in thin strips of shade. There were no long pauses. No great comfort. Only brief moments of rest before labor resumed. By midday, the heat became almost overwhelming. The Egyptian sun pressed heavily across fields, roads, workshops, and riverbanks alike. Air shimmered above the ground. Dust stuck to sweaty skin. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads or shoulders while searching for relief beneath trees or walls whenever they could. Even animals grew quieter during these hours. Donkeys slowed their pace. Dogs slept beneath carts. Birds disappeared into shaded reeds near the river. Inside crowded towns and cities, poor workers faced different struggles. Bakers, potters, brewers, and laborers worked within hot workshops where ovens and kilns made the air nearly unbearable. In one bakery near Thebes, young workers carried trays of dough through clouds of flour dust while fires roared inside clay ovens. Sweat dripped steadily down their faces. Their arms were marked with small burns from years beside intense heat. The bread they produced would feed hundreds of ordinary people. Yet the bakers themselves remained poor. Their own meals often looked little different from those of farmers in distant villages. Bread, beer, onions, beans, sometimes dates, sometimes fish. The simplicity repeated endlessly across Egyptian life. Near the marketplace, brewers worked beside enormous clay jars where grain mixtures fermented slowly beneath cloth covers. Egyptian beer production required patience and experience. The smell inside these breweries was thick and sour, filled with wet grain, yeast, smoke, and sweat. Beer mattered deeply in daily survival. Workers received beer as payment. Families stored it carefully at home. Laborers drank it after exhausting hours beneath the sun. Even religious offerings often included bread and beer because they represented the foundation of ordinary existence. A thirsty worker returning from the fields might drink deeply from a clay cup while sitting silently against a cool wall in evening shade. The drink was filling, heavy, slightly bitter, and deeply familiar. Not far away, women moved slowly through crowded market streets carrying baskets filled with lentils, onions, or small fish wrapped in reeds. Poor families rarely purchased large amounts at once. Food had to stretch carefully from day to day. Some merchants sold figs from woven trays. Others displayed garlic, cucumbers, beans, or bundles of herbs. The market air smelled of dust, fish, warm bread, sweat, and animals standing beneath the sun. Flies buzzed constantly. Voices rose and faded. Children wandered beside tired mothers while stray dogs searched for scraps beneath stalls. Yet beneath the noise, daily hunger remained close to many families. A poor harvest season could bring terrible strain. If grain stores became low, bread grew smaller and meals thinner. Families mixed extra ingredients into flour to make supplies last longer. Workers felt weakness spreading through tired limbs as food became scarce. The Nile gave life, but it could also remind people how fragile survival truly was. Flooding seasons shaped the emotional rhythm of Egyptian life. When waters rose properly, hope spread through villages. Farmers watched dark fertile mud settle across the land. The earth looked rich and promising beneath the bright sky. But when floods failed, anxiety appeared everywhere. Conversations became quieter. Families counted grain carefully. Temple officials measured supplies. Parents worried silently while children slept nearby. Ordinary people had little control over these forces. They could only work, wait, and hope the river remained generous. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, workers began returning home once more. The sunlight turned golden across the Nile. Palm shadows stretched longer over dusty roads. Boats drifted quietly along calm water carrying fish, grain, reeds, or passengers traveling between villages. The evening meal slowly became the emotional center of many households. Inside small homes, women stirred pots of lentils or beans over low fires while children sat nearby rubbing tired eyes. Bread baked earlier in the day rested in baskets lined with cloth. Smoke curled upward toward dark wooden ceiling beams. Families gathered close together because space inside poor homes was limited. A laborer might sit silently for several moments before eating, simply allowing his body to rest after endless hours beneath the sun. His hands would be rough and cracked. Dust settled deep into the lines of his skin. The first bite of warm bread could bring quiet comfort. Simple comfort. Nothing grand. Only relief. Children often ate eagerly, dipping bread into lentils or chewing onions beside clay cups of watered beer. Their laughter occasionally filled the room before exhaustion slowly quieted them again. Outside, darkness spread gently across the village. The daytime heat lingered within mud walls, but the air gradually cooled beneath the growing night. Oil lamps flickered in doorways. Voices drifted softly between neighboring homes. Some evenings brought music from simple reed flutes or quiet singing from workers gathered outside after supper. The sounds moved gently through the warm darkness before fading into silence again. Old men sat near walls speaking slowly about flood seasons from long ago. Women repaired clothing by lamplight while children fell asleep beside them. Nearby, someone baked tomorrow's bread beneath the stars. The smells of evening life mixed together across the village. Smoke. River water. Warm grain. Fish drying on racks. Dust cooling after sunset. For poor Egyptians, rest itself became precious. Their bodies carried constant fatigue. Knees hurt from kneeling in fields. Hands stiffened from grinding grain or hauling stone. Eyes burned from smoke and bright sunlight. Yet life continued through routine after routine, season after season. Many illnesses moved quietly through poor communities. Infected wounds, stomach sickness, parasites from river water, and breathing problems caused by dust and smoke shaped daily existence. Without modern medicine, ordinary pain often remained untreated. Still, people endured. Mothers cared for sick children while preparing meals. Fathers worked despite fever or exhaustion. Grandparents watched over households with tired wisdom earned through long difficult years. Food itself sometimes served as comfort during illness. Warm broth made from lentils. Soft bread soaked in beer or water. Crushed herbs mixed carefully into simple meals. These small acts carried tenderness within harsh lives. As night deepened further, the Nile became quiet once more. Moonlight shimmered across dark water. Insects hummed softly among reeds. Boats rocked gently beside muddy banks. Inside homes, families slept closely together upon mats or low beds made from woven rope. The last lamp flames flickered low while shadows moved softly across cracked walls. A farmer dreamed beside aching muscles. A baker slept with flour still dusting his arms. A fisherman rested while nets dried quietly outside. And throughout the ancient land, countless poor Egyptians drifted into sleep after another long day shaped by simple food, endless labor, and the slow enduring rhythm of the Nile River. Long before the sun appeared over the eastern desert, the Nile already carried quiet movement through the darkness. The river never truly slept. Water brushed softly against reeds and boat hulls while distant frogs called from muddy banks hidden beneath moonlight. The air before dawn felt gentle compared to the burning hours that would come later. Coolness lingered briefly over the fields. Workers often treasured these moments without speaking of them. A farmer walking toward the river with empty jars might pause for a moment simply to feel the soft wind moving across his face before the heat returned once again. Above the villages, stars slowly faded one by one. Another day was arriving. Inside small homes built from sun-dried mud brick, the first sounds of waking life began softly. Coughing from smoky rooms. A sleeping child turning beneath linen cloth. Sandals brushing across packed earth floors. Then the grinding stones began again. Throughout Egypt, thousands upon thousands of women started the same exhausting labor before sunrise. Kneeling beside low grinding stones, they crushed grain into flour with steady movements learned over many years. Their backs bent forward. Their shoulders tightened with strain. The sound filled the morning darkness. Rough. Rhythmic. Almost endless. Some women worked quietly beside daughters old enough to help. Young girls learned early how to grind grain properly, how to shape dough with careful hands, how to judge the heat inside an oven by smell and touch alone. These lessons passed gently from mother to child through ordinary mornings. No written instructions. No ceremony. Only repetition. For poor Egyptians, food preparation consumed enormous parts of daily life. Modern people far in the future would barely recognize how much labor stood behind something as simple as bread. Grain first had to be planted beside the Nile after the floods receded. Then harvested beneath dangerous heat. The stalks needed carrying, drying, storing, and pounding. After that came grinding, kneading, baking, and careful rationing within the home. Every loaf represented many hours of physical work. In one riverside village, an older woman sat alone beside her oven while dawn slowly brightened the doorway behind her. Her hands were rough and darkened by years beneath the sun. Small lines surrounded her eyes. The heat from the clay oven warmed her face as she pressed dough flat upon a worn wooden board. Nearby, onions hung from cords attached to the ceiling beams. A clay jar of beer rested against the wall. A few dried fish lay wrapped carefully in reeds to protect them from insects. This was the wealth of many poor homes. Simple food stored carefully. Nothing wasted. The old woman remembered years when the floods had failed. Years when grain jars emptied too quickly. Years when bread became smaller each week while hunger settled heavily across the village. People survived by stretching meals however they could. Extra water mixed into dough. Wild plants gathered near the river. Fish bones boiled into thin broth. Dates divided carefully among children. Even during better years, meals remained modest. Yet ordinary people found small comfort within familiar foods repeated across generations. Warm bread at sunrise. Cool water after labor. Beans simmered slowly over evening fires. The smell of onions cooking inside smoky rooms. These quiet things shaped emotional life more deeply than kings or monuments ever could for most Egyptians. As daylight spread wider across the land, workers filled the roads once again. Farmers headed toward fields carrying wooden tools polished smooth from years of use. Fishermen pushed boats into the river while waterbirds lifted lazily into pale skies. Laborers walked together in silence during the early morning hours. Their bodies still felt heavy from yesterday's work. Near one irrigation ditch, a young farmer paused briefly to eat before beginning the day. He sat upon a stone beside shallow water reflecting the brightening sky. From a cloth bundle he removed coarse bread, a small onion, and a little dried fish. The meal was plain, dry, salty, but it gave enough strength to continue. He ate slowly while listening to insects humming near the reeds. Nearby, another farmer adjusted a wooden yoke across the shoulders of an ox preparing to pull a plow through wet soil. The fields smelled rich after flooding seasons. Dark mud warmed beneath the rising sun while water glimmered softly between rows of crops. Yet the beauty of the land never removed the difficulty of working it. Farmers spent endless hours bent beneath the heat. Feet sank into wet earth. Hands blistered around rough tools. Sweat-soaked linen clothing before midday arrived. Sometimes workers sang quietly together while laboring. Slow songs repeated simple lines in steady rhythms matching the movement of their bodies. The songs were not performances. They were ways to endure time and exhaustion beneath the endless sky. Meanwhile, inside towns and cities, workshops slowly filled with noise and heat. Potters shaped clay upon spinning wheels while kilns burned nearby. Carpenters cut wood inside cramped courtyards thick with sawdust. Textile workers twisted fibers into thread beneath dim light entering through small windows. Even these workers often depended upon the same simple diet as farmers. Bread remained central to every meal. Beer remained essential. Vegetables provided small additions whenever available. A worker fortunate enough to eat fish several times a week might consider himself reasonably fed. Meat stayed rare for most poor families. Goats, sheep, and cattle were valuable animals. Slaughtering them simply for ordinary meals was often impossible for struggling households. Instead, meat appeared mainly during religious festivals, state distributions, or unusual moments of celebration. Children sometimes grew up tasting meat only a handful of times each year. Still, hunger itself existed on many levels. There was the sharp pain of true starvation during difficult years. But there was also the quieter, more constant exhaustion of never fully eating enough while performing hard labor every day. Many workers lived close to this second kind of hunger. Their bodies remained lean and worn. Their meals filled the stomach temporarily but rarely brought abundance. At midday, the Egyptian sun transformed the landscape into a world of brightness and heat. Stone walls radiated warmth. Dust shimmered above roads. The air itself seemed to slow. Workers searched desperately for shade whenever possible. A group of laborers repairing a river wall rested beneath a woven shelter made from reeds. They drank beer from shared clay jars while wiping sweat from their necks and arms. Their meal was small. Bread broken into pieces. Garlic cloves. Perhaps a few dates. One older laborer leaned against a basket while closing his eyes briefly. His hands were thick with scars. Fine dust coated his skin from years of carrying stone. Nearby, younger workers spoke quietly about flood predictions for the coming season. The Nile always remained present within conversation, thought, and worry. Everything depended upon it. If the river rose correctly, grain would grow well. If the grain grew well, bread would remain plentiful enough. If bread remained plentiful, families might survive another year without severe hunger. This chain connected nearly every ordinary life in Egypt. Along the riverbanks, children sometimes gathered reeds or searched shallow waters for shellfish and tiny fish. Poor families often depended upon every possible source of food. Even small catches mattered. Young boys learned fishing skills early. They watched older fishermen untangle nets with patient fingers. They learned how river currents moved during different seasons. They learned where fish gathered near reeds or muddy banks. Fishing itself required endurance. Hours passed beneath the hot sun with little movement except drifting water and the slow pull of nets. Skin darkened deeply beneath constant sunlight. Mosquitoes gathered during evening hours near wetlands. Yet the river also carried moments of peace. A fisherman sitting quietly inside a small wooden boat might watch birds glide low across the water while distant palms sway gently in the wind. The world could feel calm there, even within hardship. Back inside the villages, afternoon meals were often little more than leftovers from earlier in the day. Bread remained constant. Lentils or beans provided strength when available. Cucumbers and onions helped ease thirst beneath the heat. Water itself required care. Clay jars stored it as cool as possible inside shaded rooms. Families guarded their supplies carefully during the hottest months. In wealthier homes, servants prepared varied meals with spices, oils, fruits, and fine meats. But poor Egyptians rarely saw such foods closely. Their lives moved in a different world entirely. Yet even simple meals held dignity. A mother feeding children from a shared bowl beside evening firelight. An old fisherman offering part of his catch to neighbors after a good morning on the river. A laborer bringing home fresh bread while dust still covered his clothing. These acts carried quiet humanity through difficult lives. As evening slowly approached, shadows lengthened across the land once more. Workers returned from fields and workshops with tired movements. Oxen pulled slowly along dusty roads. Boats drifted toward shore carrying reeds, grain, and fish. The heat finally began to soften. People breathed more easily. Children played briefly in the streets before darkness settled. Women prepared evening fires while smoke drifted upward into orange skies. Somewhere nearby, bread baked inside ovens still warm from the day's labor. Inside one crowded home, a family gathered around a simple meal of lentil stew, onions, and coarse bread. The father's hands trembled slightly from exhaustion as he tore the loaf apart. His youngest child leaned sleepily against her mother's shoulder while chewing slowly. The room was dim except for one oil lamp flickering against the walls. Outside, voices moved softly through the narrow street. Then gradually faded. Night in poor Egyptian villages carried its own kind of silence. Not complete silence, but layered quietness. The distant sound of water. Insects humming. A dog barking once far away. Wind brushing softly against palm leaves. After sunset, many people sat outside briefly to escape the trapped heat inside their homes. Neighbors spoke quietly together while looking toward the dark river. Old people stretched aching legs. Children fell asleep beside parents beneath the stars. The sky over Egypt often appeared vast and brilliant at night. Away from palace lights and crowded temples, ordinary villagers could see endless stars scattered above the desert and river alike. Some nights felt peaceful despite hardship. Cooler wind touched tired skin. The smell of dust faded slightly beneath night air. For a few brief hours, labor paused. Eventually families returned indoors to sleep. Reed mats were spread carefully across floors. Linen cloths covered sleeping bodies lightly against the lingering warmth. Oil lamps dimmed low. And throughout the ancient villages beside the Nile, poor Egyptians drifted once more into deep exhausted sleep while grain jars rested quietly in dark corners, bread cooled beside clay ovens, and the slow eternal river continued flowing through the night. The Nile moved quietly beneath the last hours of darkness, smooth and black beneath a sky filled with fading stars. Along the riverbanks, reeds swayed gently in the night wind while sleeping villages rested close to the water that gave them life. Inside the mud brick homes, the air was still warm from the day before. Heat remained trapped within thick walls long after sunset. Families slept close together on woven mats spread across hard floors. Some turned restlessly in their sleep while others lay motionless with the deep heaviness of complete exhaustion. Outside, somewhere near the edge of the village, a donkey shifted against its rope tether. Farther away, waterbirds called softly from hidden marshes beside the Nile. Then, slowly, another day began. The first person awake in many homes was often the mother of the household. Sometimes she rose while the stars were still visible. Sometimes before even the fishermen untied their boats from the riverbank. Her body already carried the fatigue of countless mornings exactly like this one. Still, she stood. The floor felt cool beneath her feet during these early moments before sunrise. She moved quietly through the darkness so the children could sleep a little longer. Reaching for grain stored in clay jars, she prepared once again for the long work of making bread. In poor Egyptian homes, grain storage mattered deeply. Every household watched its supply carefully. Clay jars stood against walls or inside small storage rooms where grain remained protected from insects and damp air. Families understood exactly how quickly these supplies could disappear during difficult seasons. A nearly empty grain jar could bring silent fear into a household. The woman poured a measured amount of grain beside the grinding stone. Then the familiar movement began again. Her hands pushed the upper stone forward and back with practiced rhythm while fine dust rose into the dim room. The grinding stone slowly wore down both grain and body. Many women suffered constant pain in their backs, knees, shoulders, and wrists from years spent kneeling over these stones. Yet there was no choice. Bread required flour. Flour required labor. Outside, darkness softened into deep blue. One by one, other homes awakened. Faint orange light flickered behind doorways as oil lamps and cooking fires came alive again. Smoke drifted upward into the cool morning air. Somewhere nearby, someone coughed heavily before stepping into the street carrying water jars balanced carefully against the hips. The village slowly breathed itself awake. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared for the morning catch. Their boats were small and simple, built from wood worn smooth by water and years of use. Nets rested in tangled piles beside them while damp reeds brushed softly against the muddy shore. One older fisherman paused before entering his boat. He looked out across the Nile while the eastern horizon slowly brightened with pale gold light. The river looked peaceful, calm, almost endless. But he understood its moods well after decades upon the water. He had seen years when fish were plentiful and years when catches became painfully small. He had watched floodwaters rise beautifully across the fields and had also watched villages worry during weak flood seasons. Like nearly everyone in Egypt, his life followed the Nile's changing rhythms. As dawn spread farther, the fishermen pushed their boats away from shore. Water rippled quietly around the hulls. Birds circled low above the reeds searching for their own morning meal. The fishermen carried simple food with them. Bread wrapped in cloth. A few onions. Perhaps dried fish left over from earlier catches. Sometimes dates if their households had enough to spare. Nothing luxurious. Only enough to continue working. Back inside the village, children slowly began waking beneath the growing daylight. Younger children remained sleepy and quiet while older ones already helped with chores. A young boy carried kindling toward the cooking fire. A girl fetched water from a nearby well while balancing a clay jar carefully against her shoulder. Life taught responsibility early. Even childhood moved beside labor. Near one narrow street, a baker prepared his ovens for the day ahead. The bakery was already hot before sunrise. Ash covered the floor beneath the clay ovens while stacks of shaped dough waited nearby. The baker's arms were dusted white with flour. Sweat already gathered along his neck despite the early hour. He moved steadily without wasted motion, placing loaves deep into the heated chambers while smoke curled upward into the dim roof beams. The smell of fresh bread slowly spread through nearby streets. Warm. Heavy. Comforting. People passing the bakery sometimes paused briefly, breathing in the scent before continuing toward fields or workshops. For poor Egyptians, fresh bread carried emotional comfort far beyond its simple ingredients. It meant survival for another day. It meant the household still possessed grain. It meant children would not sleep hungry that night. Many workers purchased or received bread early each morning before labor began. Some loaves were coarse and dark. Others were flatter and harder after cooling. Bread varied depending on the available grain, the skill of the baker, and the fortune of the season. Yet all bread mattered deeply. Near the edge of the village, farmers moved slowly toward the fields once more. Their sandals pressed into dusty paths while oxen pulled wooden plows through damp soil near irrigation canals. The Nile's flooding had left rich dark earth across the land. In the growing fields, green shoots stretched upward beneath the strengthening sun. Farmers worked carefully to guide water where it was needed most. Irrigation demanded constant attention. Small channels carried water from the river into fields. Mud barriers had to be repaired repeatedly. Workers used simple tools to lift and direct water beneath intense heat. Hours passed slowly this way. The sound of insects hummed steadily around them. Mud clung to legs and feet. Sweat soaked through rough linen clothing. Still, meals remained small even for those performing the hardest labor. By mid-morning, a farmer might stop briefly beneath a palm tree or beside a canal bank. Sitting heavily upon the ground, he would unwrap bread from cloth already dusty from the road. Perhaps he carried beans cooked the night before. Perhaps onions. Sometimes garlic. The food was eaten slowly and without waste. Nearby workers often shared what little they had. One laborer offering dried fish. Another passing dates from a small pouch. Such sharing did not come from abundance. It came from understanding hardship together. Under the Egyptian sun, hunger was familiar to nearly everyone outside the wealthiest households. In the cities, ordinary workers faced a different kind of exhaustion. Streets became crowded quickly after sunrise. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven shades while donkeys carried grain sacks through narrow lanes. The smells of the city mixed heavily together. Warm bread. Animal dung. Fish. Smoke. Dust. Beer brewing in large clay jars. Inside workshops, labor continued relentlessly. Stone workers carved blocks beneath clouds of pale dust. Potters crouched beside spinning wheels while kill fires roared nearby. Textile workers sat shoulder to shoulder twisting fibers into thread beneath dim windows. Many workers were paid partly in food. Bread rations. Beer. Sometimes vegetables or fish. Food itself became part of economic life, exchanged alongside labor across the entire kingdom. Near one construction site, laborers rested briefly beside unfinished walls while drinking beer from clay cups. Their faces looked tired even in stillness. Dust coated their skin and settled deep into the folds of their clothing. One younger worker leaned against a basket of stone fragments while chewing slowly on dry bread. The bread scratched slightly against his mouth. Tiny grains of sand and stone remained mixed within it from grinding. But hunger overcame discomfort easily. Above them, the sky shone white with heat. The afternoon sun often transformed Egypt into a place of shimmering brightness and slow movement. Workers narrowed their eyes against the glare. Animals sought shade beneath walls or trees. Even conversation became quieter beneath the weight of the heat. For poor households, afternoons inside the home were not restful either. Women continued preparing food, weaving cloth, caring for children, cleaning grain, repairing baskets, or carrying water. The work inside homes rarely ended. Near one doorway, an elderly grandmother sat sorting lentils into clay bowls while a small child slept nearby. Her fingers moved slowly but carefully. Beside her rested a loaf wrapped in linen to protect it from flies. The smell of cooking beans drifted through the room. Simple food again. Familiar food. Food repeated across generations. As evening slowly approached, the fierce brightness of the day began softening. Long shadows stretched across the roads. Palm trees darkened against orange skies. The air cooled little by little. Workers returned home with weary movements. A fisherman carried a small catch wrapped in reeds. A farmer walked beside an ox moving slowly through dust. A brewer returned smelling of grain and yeast. One by one, families gathered again around evening meals. Inside the homes, firelight flickered softly against mud walls while clay pots simmered gently above coals. The evening meal often felt calmer than the hurried food eaten during labor hours. Children relaxed against their parents. Voices became softer. The worst heat had finally passed. Tonight's meal might include lentils cooked until thick and soft. Bread torn into pieces for dipping. Onions sliced carefully to stretch across the entire family. If fortune had been kind, perhaps fish roasted over the fire. The smell filled the small room warmly. Outside, darkness settled across the village. The Nile reflected moonlight in long silver shapes while insects hummed among the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted softly through the night air from another household where workers sat together after supper. For a little while, there was rest. A tired laborer leaned back against the wall while listening to quiet conversation around him. His stomach was not fully satisfied, but it was no longer empty. That alone brought comfort. Children slowly fell asleep beside their mothers while oil lamps burned lower. Old people spoke quietly about seasons long past when flood waters had reached higher along the fields. Then eventually the voices faded too. Families spread sleeping mats across the floors. The night air moved gently through narrow windows. And beside the slow eternal Nile, poor Egyptians once again surrendered themselves to sleep while tomorrow's grain waited silently in clay jars, ready to begin the same long journey toward bread at dawn. The darkest hour of the night had nearly passed when the first movement returned once more to the villages beside the Nile. The moon hung low above the western desert, pale and quiet, while the river continued its endless journey through the sleeping land. In the cool silence before dawn, Egypt felt softer. The heat had faded for a little while. Dust rested undisturbed upon narrow roads. Palm leaves shifted gently in the breeze coming from the water. Inside the homes of poor workers, sleep remained heavy. Bodies exhausted by labor sank deeply into woven reed mats laid across hard floors. A fisherman slept beside rolled nets still smelling faintly of river water. A baker rested with flour dust lingering beneath his fingernails. A farmer turned slowly in his sleep as aching muscles stiffened during the night. These small homes were crowded and simple. Most contained only a few rooms. The walls were built from mud brick shaped long ago beneath the sun. Cracks spread slowly through them over the years. Roofs were made from reeds, wooden beams, and packed mud that trapped heat during the long Egyptian summers. Furniture was limited. A low stool. A small chest. Clay jars stacked carefully against the wall. Woven baskets hanging from pegs. The lives inside these homes depended not upon luxury, but upon careful routines repeated every day without fail. Soon, the first lamps flickered awake again. A woman rose quietly from beside her sleeping children. She wrapped light linen around herself and moved toward the grain jars standing in the corner of the room. Her steps were slow with morning exhaustion. Outside, darkness still covered the village streets. The woman knelt beside the grinding stone. Then came the sound that greeted Egypt each morning long before sunrise. Stone against grain. Slow. Heavy. Steady. The work demanded patience more than speed. Grain had to be ground carefully into flour fine enough for dough. Tiny fragments of stone mixed into the flour almost every day, impossible to fully avoid with ancient tools. Women spent years breathing grain dust into their lungs while leaning over these stones. Their hands hardened. Their shoulders became strong from repetition. Many suffered pain in their knees and backs long before old age arrived. Yet the bread still had to be made. Without bread, the household could not continue. Nearby, another woman blew gently upon last night's embers until the cooking fire slowly returned to life. Smoke curled upward through the dim room. The smell of ash and warm earth spread softly through the house. Children stirred beneath linen coverings. The village was waking again. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, fishermen began appearing along the riverbank carrying nets over their shoulders. Their feet pressed into cool mud near the water's edge while small boats rocked gently beside wooden posts. Morning on the Nile carried its own quiet beauty. Mist drifted above the river surface. Birds moved low over the reeds. The water reflected pale silver light beneath the coming sunrise. For a few moments, before labor fully began, the world felt peaceful. One young fisherman stood silently inside his small wooden boat while untangling his nets. His father had taught him this work many years earlier when he was still a child. He had learned where fish gathered during different seasons. He had learned how currents shifted beneath flood waters. He had learned patience. Fishing required long hours of waiting mixed with moments of hard physical effort. Some days the river gave generously. Other days it gave almost nothing. Still, the fishermen returned each morning because their families depended upon the catch. As the first sunlight touched the tops of the palm trees, village streets slowly filled with movement. Bakers carried fresh loaves from hot ovens. Donkeys pulled carts loaded with jars, reeds, or grain sacks. Farmers walked toward distant fields with tools resting across their shoulders. Dust rose softly beneath their sandals. The smell of warm bread drifted through the air. Near the marketplace, merchants prepared their stalls beneath woven shades that offered little protection once the full heat arrived. Clay bowls filled with lentils, beans, onions, and dates were arranged carefully beside baskets of fish and bundles of herbs. Poor families moved through these markets with cautious eyes. Every purchase mattered. Every measure of grain had value. One mother paused beside a merchant selling dried fish. Her young child stood quietly beside her while she counted small pieces of copper and examined the fish carefully. Food could not be wasted on poor quality. Nearby, another merchant sold rough loaves still warm from the oven. The scent carried through the market, mixing with smells of animals, river mud, sweat, and smoke from cooking fires already burning across the city. The marketplace grew louder as morning continued. Voices called softly across narrow lanes. Pottery clinked together. Goats pulled against ropes. Children ran barefoot through crowded paths. Yet even here, beneath the movement and sound, hunger remained close to many people. Meals were measured carefully. Supplies were watched constantly. A family with only a little grain remaining before the next harvest carried silent worry through every day. Beyond the villages and cities, farmers worked beneath the strengthening sun. Irrigation canals carried Nile water slowly through the fields while workers guided the flow with wooden tools and mud barriers. The labor was endless. A farmer bent low beside wet soil while planting seedlings into the earth. His hands were coated with mud. Sweat rolled slowly down his face despite the early hour. Nearby, oxen pulled wooden plows through dark fertile ground left behind after the Nile floods receded. The animals moved slowly beneath the growing heat, their hooves sinking into damp earth. For poor farmers, food and labor were deeply connected. The grain they planted would eventually return to them as bread. The beans growing nearby would later simmer in clay pots during evening meals. Everything began in the fields. Everything returned there. As the sun climbed higher, the heat spread quickly across Egypt. The cool softness of dawn disappeared beneath bright white light. Air shimmered above the roads. Stone walls radiated warmth. Workers paused whenever small patches of shade appeared. A group of laborers repairing an irrigation ditch sat together beneath a palm tree eating their midday meal. One man carried coarse bread wrapped in cloth. Another shared onions and garlic from a small woven basket. The food was plain but nourishing enough to continue. They ate slowly, saying little. Exhaustion often silenced conversation during the hottest hours. Far away in grand temples and palaces, wealthy Egyptians enjoyed richer meals filled with honey, roasted meats, fruits, cakes, and fine oils. But such foods rarely entered the homes of ordinary workers. Most poor Egyptians lived close to simplicity their entire lives. Bread remained the center of nearly every meal. Beer remained the daily drink. Lentils, beans, onions, fish, and dates added what they could. Even small amounts of oil or herbs could make a meal feel special. Inside one crowded city workshop, textile workers sat shoulder to shoulder weaving linen cloth while sunlight entered through narrow openings high above them. Their fingers moved carefully across the threads despite tiredness and heat. A clay jar of beer rested nearby for the workers to share. At midday, one young worker dipped dry bread into the beer to soften it before eating. The bread had already hardened beneath the heat, but nothing was wasted. Food carried too much value. Nearby, an older worker rubbed aching wrists before returning to the loom. Years of repetitive labor slowly shaped the body into something worn and tired. Yet the work continued day after day. Outside, the city streets grew quieter during the hottest part of the afternoon. Animals rested in shadows. Merchants sat beneath shaded coverings wiping sweat from their faces. Dust hung motionless in the air. Then, slowly, the sun began descending once more. The light softened into deeper gold across the Nile Valley. Evening wind returned gently from the river. Workers started their journeys home. This hour often brought a feeling of relief. The hardest heat had passed. Families would gather soon. Cooking fires appeared again across the villages as smoke drifted upward into the evening sky. Women stirred lentils and beans inside blackened clay pots while children waited nearby, tired from the long day. The smell of cooking food moved softly through the streets. Warm grain, garlic, fish roasting slowly above coals, fresh bread cooling beside ovens. One laborer returned home carrying a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside were several onions and a little dried fish purchased at the market after work. His youngest daughter smiled sleepily when she saw the fish. It would make tonight's meal feel slightly fuller than usual. Inside the house, the family gathered closely together on reed mats. The father tore bread apart carefully so each person received enough. Lentils were ladled into small bowls. Beer was poured from a clay jar into cups worn smooth by years of use. No one rushed. The room glowed softly beneath firelight. Outside, darkness settled slowly across the Nile once more. After supper, neighbors sat together near doorways enjoying the cooler evening air. Some repaired fishing nets by lamplight. Others mended sandals or patched worn clothing. An old man sat quietly watching the moon rise above the river while speaking softly about flood seasons from many years earlier. Nearby children listened sleepily while leaning against their mothers. The village sounds gradually softened. Conversations faded. Animals settled. The river continued flowing beside the sleeping land. One by one, lamps dimmed inside the homes. Families stretched out upon reed mats while warm night air moved gently through the rooms. Hunger still existed for many. Exhaustion certainly remained. Yet for this brief moment, there was also rest. And beside the slow dark Nile, poor Egyptians drifted once again into another deep ancient night, surrounded by the simple foods, familiar routines, and quiet labors that shaped nearly every hour of their lives. The Nile flowed beneath the stars with slow and steady silence. Its dark surface reflected strips of moonlight that trembled gently whenever the night wind crossed the water. Along the muddy banks, tall reeds whispered softly together while sleeping birds rested hidden deep inside them. Far beyond the temples and stone monuments that would survive into distant ages, ordinary Egyptian villages lay quietly beside the river. Their mud brick walls looked pale beneath the moonlight. Roofs of reeds and timber rested under warm night air that still carried traces of the day's heat. Inside these homes, poor families slept closely together. Children curled beside mothers. Fathers rested with tired arms folded across aching chests. Grandparents shifted slowly in sleep while insects hummed faintly outside. The labor of the previous day still lingered inside their bodies. Muscles hurt from carrying water, grinding grain, lifting stone, rowing boats, digging canals, and walking beneath the burning Egyptian sun. Yet before long, morning would return once again. It always did. Long before sunrise, a faint gray light began touching the eastern horizon beyond the desert. The stars slowly faded. Cool air drifted through the narrow village streets where yesterday's footprints still marked the dust. A woman woke first inside a small riverside home. For a moment she remained still, listening to the quiet breathing of her family around her. Nearby, a clay jar rested against the wall beside baskets woven from reeds. The smell of ash and old smoke lingered in the room. Then she rose carefully from the reed mat. The floor beneath her feet felt cool for now, though she knew the heat would soon return. She wrapped linen around her shoulders and crossed the dim room toward the grain jars standing in the corner. Inside the jars lay the center of survival. Barley. Emmer wheat. Enough, hopefully, for another week. She lifted a small measure into a bowl and carried it toward the grinding stone. Then the morning rhythm began again. Stone sliding against grain. Slow pressure. Dust rising softly into the air. The sound became part of Egypt itself. In villages large and small, wealthy or poor, the grinding stones spoke before dawn every single day. But among poor households, the work fell especially heavily upon women whose lives revolved around endless preparation of simple meals. The woman's daughter soon woke beside her and quietly joined the work. She was still young, but already her hands understood these motions. Childhood in poor Egyptian homes disappeared slowly into responsibility. The girl gathered kindling for the fire while her mother continued grinding. Outside, darkness softened further. Nearby homes awakened one by one. Faint lamp glow appeared behind doorways. Someone coughed in the distance. A donkey shifted beside its tether and stamped against the earth. Then came the smell of baking bread. Warm and comforting, it slowly spread through the village streets while ovens heated across the settlement. Bakers and households alike shaped dough with practiced hands while smoke curled upward into the brightening sky. Bread existed at nearly every moment of Egyptian life. Workers carried it to the fields. Children ate it sitting beside doorways. Old people softened stale pieces in water or beer before chewing slowly. Even the dead were buried with bread offerings so they would not go hungry beyond life itself. The loaves made for poor families were often rough and dark. They could be hard after cooling. Small bits of grit sometimes remained trapped inside from the grinding process. Yet hunger gave the bread importance beyond taste. A fresh loaf meant strength for labor. It meant survival. As dawn arrived fully, fishermen pushed their boats into the Nile once more. Water splashed quietly against wood while long poles pressed into muddy river beds. Nets lay coiled beside baskets woven from reeds. One elderly fisherman paused while watching the sunrise spread across the water. Gold light slowly touched the river surface. Birds crossed low overhead. The air smelled of wet mud and reeds warmed gently by morning light. For a brief moment, before work truly began, the world felt calm. Then the fisherman bent to his nets again. Fishing required patience and endurance. Hours passed beneath the open sky while boats drifted slowly through changing currents. The sun burned against uncovered skin. Hands grew rough from rope and water. Still, fish remained one of the few reliable sources of protein available to poor Egyptians. Fresh fish might be roasted over evening fires. Smaller catches were salted and dried beneath the sun for later use. The smell of drying fish lingered heavily near riverside villages, mixing with smoke, river water, and hot dust. Back in the growing daylight, farmers already filled the roads leading toward the fields. Their sandals stirred pale dust beneath each step. Wooden hoes rested across tired shoulders. Oxen moved slowly beside them with heavy patient breathing. The Nile flood season shaped the entire rhythm of farming life. After the waters retreated, they left behind rich dark mud spread across the land. Farmers planted quickly while moisture remained strong within the soil. But the work was exhausting. Men bent low for hours beneath fierce sunlight while insects swarmed near irrigation channels. Mud clung thickly around their ankles. Water had to be guided carefully from canals into thirsty fields. A farmer's meal during these long mornings was often very small. Perhaps coarse bread wrapped in cloth. A few onions. Maybe lentils left over from the previous night. Sometimes dates if the harvest had been kind. The food filled the stomach only enough to continue working. At one irrigation ditch, several workers paused briefly to rest beneath a palm tree. Their faces were already wet with sweat though the day had barely begun. One man broke bread into smaller pieces and passed them silently among the group. Nearby, another worker drank from a clay jar of beer. The beer was thick and sour, filled with bits of grain floating near the surface. It was not a luxury drink. It was nourishment. Workers depended upon it for strength and hydration during long hours beneath the heat. Even children drank watered forms of beer within many households. Clean stored water was difficult to maintain in Egypt's climate, especially for poor families living close together. As the sun climbed higher, the heat slowly transformed the landscape. Morning softness disappeared beneath bright white light. Roads shimmered in the distance. Stone walls grew hot enough to burn skin after long exposure. The poor felt the weight of the heat constantly because most labor happened outdoors or inside cramped workshops filled with ovens, kilns, or crowded bodies. In one city bakery, young workers carried trays of dough through clouds of flour dust while fires roared inside clay ovens. Their tunics clung damply to their skin. Ash coated their arms. Sweat dripped steadily from their faces. Still, the loaves had to be baked. Hundreds of workers depended upon them. The bakery smelled rich with grain and smoke. Heat pressed heavily against the chest. Yet outside, the streets were growing even hotter. Merchants sat beneath woven shades in crowded markets while flies gathered around baskets of fish and vegetables. Clay jars filled with lentils, beans, and beer lined the edges of narrow stalls. Poor families moved carefully through these markets, calculating every purchase in their minds. A mother examined onions one by one before choosing only a small handful. An old laborer counted tiny copper pieces before buying bread. A fisherman traded part of his catch for lentils and oil. Food decisions shaped daily survival. Nothing could be wasted. Inside homes during the afternoon, women continued working despite the heat. Grain was cleaned. Dough prepared. Children washed. Clothing repaired. Water jars refilled from wells or riverbanks. Many homes trapped smoke from cooking fires within their walls. The air inside could feel thick and difficult to breathe. Yet the work continued because evening meals still needed preparation. A grandmother sat near one doorway sorting beans slowly into bowls while watching children play sleepily nearby. Her hands moved carefully despite swollen fingers stiffened by age and labor. Beside her, a clay pot simmered gently above low coals. The smell of lentils drifted softly through the room. Simple food again. Quiet food. Food that had filled Egyptian stomachs for countless generations. As evening approached, relief slowly spread through the villages and cities alike. Shadows lengthened across roads. The fierce brightness softened into warm gold. Wind from the river returned gently at last. Workers began making their way home. A farmer walked with tired, slow steps beside irrigation canals glowing orange beneath sunset light. Fishermen carried small catches wrapped in reeds. Laborers brushed dust from their arms before entering narrow village streets. Children waited near doorways watching for returning parents. Then evening fires came alive across the land once more. Smoke rose into the darkening sky. Bread warmed beside ovens. Fish roasted slowly above coals. Families gathered close together on reed mats while clay bowls passed from hand to hand. The meals remained modest. Bread. Beans. Onions. Beer. Perhaps fish tonight if the river had been generous. But after endless hours of labor, even simple food could feel deeply comforting. Voices softened as darkness spread. Oil lamps flickered against mud walls. Outside, the Nile moved quietly through the warm Egyptian night while poor families slowly drifted toward sleep again, wrapped within the familiar rhythm of hunger, labor, bread, and the eternal river that carried their lives forward day after day. Night rested softly across the Nile Valley while the river moved through darkness with calm and patient silence. Moonlight touched the water in long trembling patterns that drifted slowly beside clusters of reeds growing along the muddy banks. The villages beside the Nile looked quiet from a distance. Low mud brick homes rested close together beneath the warm sky. Small courtyards sat empty beneath the moonlight. Clay ovens cooled gradually after the evening meal. Dogs slept beside narrow doorways while donkeys stood motionless near wooden fences. Inside the homes of poor Egyptians, families rested deeply after another exhausting day. Their lives were filled with labor so constant that sleep often came quickly and heavily. The body gave in without resistance after endless hours beneath the Egyptian sun. A fisherman slept beside a folded net still carrying the smell of river water and fish. A woman rested with sore shoulders after grinding grain since before dawn. A young laborer lay on his back staring briefly at the ceiling before sleep finally reached him. The room around him remained warm even at night. The walls held onto the day's heat. The air smelled faintly of smoke, dust, and baked grain. Outside, the Nile continued flowing as it always had. The river shaped every part of life. Without the Nile, there would be no fields, no grain, no bread, no beer, no villages resting quietly beneath the stars. Everything depended upon the movement of water through the dry land. Hours passed slowly. Then, once again, the darkness before dawn arrived. This hour belonged to workers, to bakers, to women beside grinding stones, to fishermen preparing boats in silence. The eastern horizon was still dark when the first lamps began glowing inside village homes. Tiny points of orange light appeared one by one behind narrow windows and doorways. Inside one small house near the riverbank, a mother quietly sat beside her sleeping children. For a moment she rubbed her tired eyes while listening to the soft sounds of the night outside. Then she reached for the grain jar. Her fingers moved carefully inside it, measuring how much remained. Not empty yet. That alone brought a small feeling of relief. Food anxiety lived quietly inside many poor households. Families watched grain supplies closely throughout the year, especially before harvest seasons arrived. Every scoop mattered. Every loaf mattered. The woman poured grain beside the grinding stone and began the slow morning labor once again. Stone sliding against stone. Grain breaking beneath pressure. Dust floating softly through the dim room. Nearby, her husband still slept for a little while longer before another day in the fields. His hands were rough and scarred from years of farm work. The muscles in his legs ached constantly during planting seasons. Soon he too would wake. And the long day would begin again. Outside, cool air drifted through the narrow streets. The village still rested mostly in silence. A few figures moved slowly through the darkness carrying water jars or bundles of kindling. At the ovens, bakers were already working. The heat from the fires glowed brightly against the dark sky while rough dough was shaped into loaves upon worn wooden boards. Flour dust covered arms, hands, and clothing. The smell of warm grain spread outward through the streets, comforting and familiar. Bread was the first thought of many mornings. Workers depended upon it before entering fields and workshops. Children reached for it while still sleeping. Old people softened hard crusts in beer or water before eating slowly. No food carried greater importance. The poor rarely had the luxury of variety. Most meals repeated the same simple ingredients day after day. Yet repetition itself created a kind of stability within difficult lives. Bread in the morning. Beer beneath the afternoon heat. Beans simmering over evening fires. Fish when fortune allowed. These familiar foods gave structure to ordinary existence. As the horizon slowly brightened, fishermen untied their boats from wooden posts driven into the muddy shore. Mist hovered low above the Nile while reeds swayed gently in the early breeze. One young fisherman stepped carefully into his narrow boat while carrying a basket filled with nets and hooks. He had eaten only a small piece of bread before leaving home, but it was enough for now. The river smelled fresh during these early hours. Cool mud. Wet reeds. Flowing water. Far overhead, birds crossed the brightening sky while the fishermen pushed away from shore using a long wooden pole. The Nile looked peaceful at dawn. White and silver beneath the growing light. But survival upon the river demanded patience and endurance. Fishing often meant long quiet hours beneath the sun while waiting for movement beneath the water. Some mornings rewarded the fishermen with heavy nets. Other mornings left them discouraged and hungry. Still, they returned again and again because the river remained one of the few reliable sources of food for poor households. Back in the villages, the road slowly filled with workers heading toward the fields. Sandals scraped against dry earth while oxen moved patiently beside wooden plows. Farmers understood the moods of the land deeply. They watched the Nile floods carefully each year. They studied the color of the soil and the movement of water through irrigation channels. Their lives depended entirely upon successful harvests. Without grain, suffering spread quickly. The fields near the river looked beautiful during growing seasons. Green plants stretched across dark fertile earth beneath endless blue skies. Palm trees sway gently at the edges of irrigation canals. But beauty did not remove hardship. The work itself remained exhausting. Farmers bent low for hours beneath fierce sunlight while insects gathered around wet soil. Mud stuck heavily to their legs. Sweat soaked through rough linen clothing before morning had fully passed. At one field beside a narrow canal, several workers paused briefly to eat. Their meal was simple. Coarse bread broken into pieces. A few onions shared among them. Beer poured carefully from a clay jar. They sat quietly in thin shade cast by a palm tree while breathing heavily from labor. Nearby, the sound of water moving through the canal mixed softly with insect songs rising from the reeds. For a few moments, there was rest. Then work resumed. Across Egypt, poor laborers lived within constant cycles of effort and recovery. The body never fully healed before more work arrived. Stone workers hauled blocks beneath blazing skies. Boatmen rowed against river currents. Servants climbed endless stairs carrying water jars. Women spent hours grinding grain, baking bread, weaving cloth, and caring for children. Even old age rarely brought complete rest. An elderly fisherman might no longer cast heavy nets, but he could still repair them beside the riverbank while younger men worked the boats. An old woman whose knees hurt too badly for grinding grain might sort lentils or watch children beside the cooking fire. Every person contributed something. Inside crowded towns and cities, ordinary workers faced heat and exhaustion of a different kind. Workshops trapped smoke and warmth within narrow walls. Streets filled with dust kicked upward by sandals, carts, and animals. The smells were everywhere. Bread baking. Fish drying. Sweat. Animal dung. Beer fermenting inside clay jars. Smoke drifting from ovens. In one small brewery, workers stirred grain mixtures inside large pottery vessels while steam rose into the air. The smell was thick and sour. Beer production required enormous amounts of grain, but beer itself was essential to Egyptian life. Workers received it as payment. Families drank it daily. Travelers carried it along dusty roads. For the poor, beer was not celebration. It was nourishment. At midday, the heat became almost unbearable. The sky turned pale with brightness. Roads shimmered beneath the sun. Even breathing sometimes felt difficult within crowded streets or open fields. Animals searched desperately for shade. Workers covered their heads with cloth whenever possible. A laborer carrying stone for a construction project paused briefly beside a wall while wiping sweat from his face. Dust coated his arms and chest. His stomach already felt empty again, though he had eaten earlier. Physical labor consumed strength quickly beneath the Egyptian climate. Many poor workers likely lived their entire lives slightly hungry. Their meals provided enough to survive, but rarely enough for true fullness. Still, moments of comfort existed. Cool water after hours in the fields. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. A quiet evening breeze from the Nile. Children laughing softly beside a cooking fire. These small things mattered deeply. As afternoon faded toward evening, the fierce sunlight softened into gold across the riverbanks. Workers slowly made their way home once again. Boats returned to shore carrying fish and reeds. Farmers brushed dirt from their legs before entering village streets. Cooking fires began appearing throughout the settlements. Smoke rose gently into the darkening sky. Inside the homes, evening meals were prepared with care despite limited ingredients. Lentils simmered slowly inside clay pots blackened from years above the fire. Bread rested beneath linen cloths. Fish roasted when available. Families gathered closely together because there was little space inside most homes. The meals remained modest. Bread dipped into beans. Onions sliced thinly to feed many people. Beer shared carefully among adults and children. Yet after long exhausting days, the warmth of food and family brought quiet relief. Outside, the Nile reflected the first stars of the night. Voices drifted softly through the village streets before slowly fading away. Somewhere nearby, a reed flute played a slow melody carried gently by the evening wind. Children fell asleep beside their parents. Old people rested against mud brick walls while watching the moon rise above the river. And throughout the ancient land, poor Egyptians once again surrendered themselves to the rhythm that shaped nearly every moment of their lives: labor beneath the sun, simple meals beside firelight, and sleep beside the endless flowing Nile. The night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley while warm wind moved gently across the dark water. Reeds along the riverbank bent softly beneath the breeze, making faint whispering sounds that blended with the distant calls of night birds hidden among the marshes. The villages beside the river had grown quiet again. Oil lamps flickered weakly inside a few homes where families had not yet fallen asleep. Most workers, however, already rested heavily upon reed mats after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. The air inside the mud brick houses remained thick with trapped warmth. Smoke from evening cooking fires lingered near the ceilings. Clay jars stood silently against the walls beside woven baskets filled with onions, lentils, or grain carefully stored for the coming days. One elderly woman remained awake a little longer than the others inside her small home. Her knees hurt badly during cold mornings now, and sleep sometimes arrived slowly with age. She sat quietly beside the doorway looking out toward the moonlit village street. A loaf of bread rested beside her beneath a cloth. Tomorrow morning it would become breakfast. Perhaps softened in beer. Perhaps eaten dry beside onions. Simple food once again. The old woman had eaten such meals for nearly her entire life. As a child, she had watched her mother grind grain before dawn. As a young wife, she herself had knelt beside the grinding stone while carrying babies on her hip. As an old grandmother, she now watched younger women continue the same endless rhythm. Generations passed, yet the routines remained almost unchanged. At last she lowered herself carefully onto the reed mat beside her sleeping family. Outside, the village slowly surrendered completely to silence. Only the Nile continued moving. Steady. Endless. Ancient even then. Hours later, darkness still covered the land when the first worker awoke once more. Dawn remained far away, but the poor could not sleep long if bread was to be prepared before labor began. Inside one crowded riverside home, a young mother slowly sat upright while rubbing soreness from her wrists. Beside her, two small children slept curled together beneath light linen cloth. The room smelled of dust, smoke, and grain. Quietly, she crossed toward the corner where the grinding stones waited. The work began again. Back and forth. Slow pressure. The steady scraping sound filled the room softly while grain broke beneath the heavy stone. Many women spent hours every day in this position. Their fingers became thick and rough. Their backs curved forward from years of kneeling. Yet their labor often remained unnoticed beyond the household itself. Without them, there would be no bread waiting for workers each morning. Outside, the eastern sky slowly turned from black to deep blue. A fisherman walked silently toward the river carrying a rolled net over his shoulder. His sandals pressed lightly into cool dust while stars still glimmered faintly overhead. Morning beside the Nile carried a calm beauty that many workers knew well. The river surface reflected the first pale traces of dawn. Mist drifted low above the water. Palm trees stood motionless against the brightening horizon. For a few quiet moments before sunrise, Egypt seemed to pause. Then labor returned. The fisherman pushed his small wooden boat into the water and climbed inside carefully. The smell of wet reeds and river mud surrounded him as he untangled his nets. He had eaten very little the night before. Only bread and lentils. His stomach still felt slightly hollow. But hunger was familiar. Most poor Egyptians carried some degree of hunger through large parts of their lives. Meals provided enough to continue working, but rarely enough for comfort or fullness. Still, the fisherman hoped for a good catch this morning. Fish meant extra food for the household. Perhaps enough to dry some for later days. Perhaps enough to trade in the market for onions or beans. The boat drifted slowly away from shore. Back in the village, the smell of baking bread soon spread through the narrow streets. Bakers and families alike worked beside hot clay ovens while smoke rose into the cool dawn air. Children slowly awakened to the familiar scent. A young boy rubbed sleep from his eyes while his mother tore a warm loaf into smaller pieces for the morning meal. The bread was coarse and dark, with the rough crust hardened by the oven fire. The family ate quietly together. Bread. A little beer. Onions shared carefully between them. Then the father stood and prepared for the fields. The road soon filled with workers moving toward farmland beyond the villages. Oxen pulled wooden plows beside irrigation canals while birds circled overhead searching for insects among the reeds. The Nile floodwaters had long ago retreated, leaving dark fertile soil across the valley. Farmers now worked constantly to maintain crops beneath the strengthening heat. Water had to be guided carefully through channels cut into the earth. Weeds had to be cleared. Young plants protected. The labor never truly ended. One farmer paused briefly beside a canal to wash dust from his hands before beginning the day's work. He looked tired already. Fine lines surrounded his eyes despite his relatively young age. Years beneath the sun aged people quickly. Nearby, another worker carried baskets filled with harvested onions toward a storage area built from mud brick. The sharp smell of the onions lingered heavily in the warm air. Onions formed an important part of the poor Egyptian diet. They were simple, filling, and easier to store than many other foods. Workers carried them into the fields because they traveled well beneath the heat. Garlic too was valued for similar reasons. Strong flavors helped break the monotony of endless bread and grain. As the morning advanced, the sun climbed steadily higher above the Nile Valley. The coolness of dawn faded quickly. Heat spread across the fields. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust rose beneath every footstep. In one distant field, laborers harvesting grain moved slowly in long lines beneath the bright sky. They cut stalks carefully with simple blades while gathering bundles into piles for transport. Harvest seasons were exhausting but deeply important. Entire communities depended upon successful grain collection. Poor harvests meant fear, hunger, and uncertainty during the months ahead. A worker carrying grain bundles paused to drink from a clay jar of beer resting beneath a tree. The beer was thick and warm from the rising temperature, but it still eased thirst better than nothing at all. Nearby, several laborers sat briefly in the shade sharing their midday meal. Bread torn into rough pieces. A handful of dates. Beans mashed with oil. Simple food again. Yet they ate with deep focus because hard labor sharpened hunger quickly. The sounds around them remained gentle despite the work. Wind moving through grain stalks. Water trickling softly through irrigation channels. Insects humming in the heat. Distant voices carried faintly across the fields. Then the workers rose once more and returned to labor. In towns and cities, meanwhile, markets had become crowded beneath woven awnings offering narrow strips of shade. Merchants called quietly to passing customers while flies gathered around baskets of fish laid upon reed mats. Poor families moved carefully through the busy streets. A mother carrying a small child examined lentils stored in large clay bowls. An elderly man traded woven baskets for bread. A fisherman sold part of his morning catch before returning home with only a few small fish remaining for his own family. The smells of the marketplace mixed heavily together. Fresh bread. River fish. Dust. Smoke. Animals standing in the heat. Beer fermenting nearby. For many poor Egyptians, the market was not a place of abundance. It was a place of careful decisions and measured purchases. Every handful of grain mattered. Every copper piece mattered. Inside workshops, laborers continued working despite the growing afternoon heat. Potters shaped wet clay while kilns roared nearby. Brewers stirred grain mixtures inside giant jars. Linen workers sat shoulder to shoulder weaving cloth with tired fingers. Meals were often eaten quickly while sitting upon floors or low stools. Dry bread softened in beer. Onions sliced with small knives. Fish shared among several workers. No feast. Only enough to continue. As afternoon slowly faded toward evening, the harsh brightness of the day finally softened. Long shadows stretched across roads and fields. Palm trees darkened against golden skies. Relief spread quietly through the land. Workers began walking home. A farmer carried leftover bread wrapped carefully in cloth. A fisherman balanced empty nets across his shoulder. Children waited beside doorways watching for returning parents. Soon the evening fires appeared once again. Smoke drifted upward through warm twilight while lentils simmered gently inside clay pots. Bread warmed beside glowing coals. Fish roasted slowly over open flames when families were fortunate enough to have them. Inside one small home, a tired laborer sat cross-legged beside his children while eating the evening meal. The room glowed softly from a single oil lamp. His youngest daughter leaned sleepily against his arm while chewing bread dipped into beans. Outside, the Nile reflected the first stars appearing above the darkening land. Voices drifted softly through the village before gradually fading into quiet. Then one by one, the lamps dimmed. Families stretched out upon reed mats. The warm night breeze entered through narrow windows. And beside the slow eternal river, poor Egyptians drifted once more into exhausted sleep surrounded by the simple foods, familiar labors, and quiet routines that shaped the rhythm of their ancient lives. The Nile carried the night forward with slow dark movement beneath the stars. Along its banks, reeds swayed gently in the warm wind while the mud brick villages rested in silence beside the water. Far from the great stone temples and royal tombs, ordinary Egyptians slept inside small crowded homes where the smell of smoke and baked grain lingered long after the evening fires had faded. Their lives moved quietly through routines repeated so many times that even the children understood them without needing instruction. The grain jars in the corner. The grinding stone beside the wall. The reed mats spread across the floor. The clay cups stacked carefully near the cooking fire. These simple objects shaped entire lives. Inside one small home near the edge of a farming village, a young boy stirred awake while darkness still covered the sky outside. For a moment he listened to the breathing of his family around him. Then he heard it. The soft scraping rhythm of his mother grinding grain. The sound greeted him nearly every morning of his life. Stone against stone. Back and forth. Slow and steady. He remained lying still while the room slowly brightened from the tiny oil lamp beside her. Dust floated through the air around the grinding stone while his mother worked with tired practiced movements. Her hands looked older than her face. The skin along her fingers had hardened from years of labor. Fine grain dust clung to her arms and clothing. Still, the bread had to be prepared before sunrise. Soon his father would leave for the fields. Soon the heat would return. The boy closed his eyes briefly again while the smell of warming grain slowly spread through the room. Outside, the Nile remained hidden beneath darkness, though faint silver light from the moon still touched the water. Fishermen already moved quietly along the riverbank preparing their boats. The poor could not afford to waste the cool hours before dawn. One fisherman stepped carefully into shallow water while pushing his narrow boat away from shore. The mud felt cool beneath his feet. Nearby, another man untangled nets by touch alone in the darkness. The river smelled fresh during these hours. Wet reeds. Cool water. Soft river mud. For a few brief moments, before the first sunlight reached the valley, the world felt calm and gentle. Then dawn slowly arrived once more. The eastern sky softened from black to blue, and the first birds crossed above the Nile while village ovens began glowing with firelight. Smoke drifted upward into the brightening air. The smell of fresh bread followed soon after. Warm and earthy. Simple and comforting. Bakers worked beside blazing clay ovens while sweat already gathered across their skin. Their work began long before most of the village fully awakened. Bread shaped every part of Egyptian survival. Workers carried it into the fields. Boatmen wrapped it in cloth for river journeys. Children dipped it into lentils at night beside cooking fires. Even travelers walking dusty roads through the desert carried loaves tied carefully beside water jars. A household without bread felt dangerously uncertain. Inside the home, the young boy finally sat upright while his mother shaped dough with tired hands. His younger sister still slept beside the wall beneath a thin linen cloth. The morning meal was already waiting. A small loaf divided carefully between the family. Onions sliced thinly. Beer poured into clay cups. Nothing more. Yet no one complained. Meals like this had fed their parents and grandparents before them. The father ate quietly while preparing for the day ahead. Soon he stood, adjusted the linen around his waist, and stepped outside into the cool dawn air. Other workers already moved through the village streets beside him. Farmers. Laborers. Servants. Men carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. The roads leading toward the fields slowly filled with movement while the sun rose over the eastern desert. At first the morning remained pleasant enough. A cool breeze drifted from the river. Palm trees cast long shadows across the paths. Irrigation canals reflected soft gold light beneath the growing sky. But everyone knew the heat would come quickly. Near the fields, farmers began their labor before the full strength of the sun arrived. Some cleared weeds from irrigation channels while others guided oxen pulling wooden plows through dark fertile soil left behind by the Nile floods. The land near the river looked rich and green during growing seasons, yet survival there still demanded constant physical effort. Mud clung heavily to feet and sandals. Mosquitoes gathered near standing water. The sun burned skin hour after hour. One older farmer worked silently beside his son while carrying baskets filled with young plants. His back remained bent from decades of labor. Deep lines crossed his face from years beneath bright skies. Still, he moved carefully and steadily. The fields needed tending. Food depended upon these small daily tasks. Without successful harvests, hunger spread quickly across poor villages. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through linen clothing while workers paused briefly beside irrigation ditches to eat. Their meals remained simple. Bread, garlic, a few dates. Perhaps beans carried from home in clay bowls. One worker softened dry bread in beer before eating slowly beneath a palm tree. Nearby, another man lay briefly in the shade with his arm covering his eyes while insects hummed softly around the canal water. The heat deepened steadily. Air shimmered above the fields. Dust rose from every path. The Nile itself looked brighter now beneath the fierce sunlight, its calm surface reflecting the pale sky. Back in the villages and towns, women continued working inside homes that trapped heat within their mud brick walls. Grain needed sorting. Bread needed baking. Water needed carrying. Children cried softly in the warmth while mothers stirred lentils above cooking fires. A young woman crossed the village carrying a heavy clay jar balanced carefully upon her shoulder. Sweat rolled slowly down her neck as she walked. The jar contained water drawn earlier from the river. Water itself required labor. Everything required labor. Even the smallest meal depended upon many difficult tasks completed beneath the Egyptian climate. At the marketplace, merchants arranged onions, fish, beans, and dates beneath woven shades while customers moved carefully between the stalls. The smells there mixed together heavily. Warm bread from nearby ovens. Fish drying in the sun. Animal sweat. Dust. Smoke from cooking fires. A poor laborer stood quietly examining a basket of figs while counting tiny copper pieces in his hand. He wanted enough food to bring home for his children, but prices shifted depending on harvests and river conditions. Sometimes families could afford small comforts. A little oil. Fresh fruit. Extra fish. Other times they returned home with only bread and onions once again. Still, people adapted. Poor Egyptians became skilled at stretching food carefully across many days. Leftover bread might be softened in soup or beer. Fish bones could flavor broth. Lentils simmered slowly could feed an entire household. Nothing was wasted. Inside one city workshop, laborers paused briefly during the hottest part of the afternoon. The room smelled strongly of clay and smoke from nearby kilns. A potter sat against the wall wiping sweat from his forehead while eating his midday meal. Bread torn into pieces. A handful of beans. Beer warm from the heat. The food was plain, but exhaustion sharpened appetite enough that even simple meals felt satisfying for a little while. Then work resumed. Outside, the streets grew quieter beneath the crushing afternoon heat. Dogs slept in patches of shade. Donkeys stood motionless beside carts. Even conversation slowed. Egypt during the hottest hours often felt heavy and still, as though the entire land waited patiently for evening. At last the sunlight began softening toward gold. Long shadows stretched across fields and roads. A breeze returned from the Nile. Workers slowly lifted their heads with relief. The day's hardest hours had passed. Farmers gathered tools before beginning the walk home. Fishermen returned with their catches wrapped carefully in reeds. Merchants packed away unsold goods while smoke from evening fires rose once more above the villages. Inside the homes, cooking began again. Lentils simmered quietly. Bread warmed beside glowing coals. Fish roasted slowly when available. Families gathered closely together upon reed mats while the light from oil lamps flickered against mud walls. The meals remained modest, yet evening carried a softer feeling than the hard bright hours of the day. Children leaned sleepily against parents. Voices stayed low and calm. The smell of warm grain filled the room. Outside, the Nile reflected the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. An old fisherman sat beside the river repairing a torn net by moonlight while listening to water moving gently against the shore. Nearby, reeds swayed softly in the warm night breeze. Soon the village grew quiet again. Lamps dimmed one by one. Families stretched out upon reed mats with tired bodies aching from another day of labor. And beside the eternal Nile, poor Egyptians drifted once more into sleep. While grain rested silently inside clay jars, waiting for morning to begin the same ancient rhythm again. The river moved through the darkness like a long slow breath beneath the stars. Moonlight shimmered softly upon the Nile while reeds bent gently in the warm night wind. The villages along the riverbanks rested quietly, their mud brick walls pale beneath the silver glow of the late hour. Inside the homes of poor Egyptians, sleep settled heavily across tired bodies. A farmer slept with cracked hands folded against his chest. A woman rested beside the grinding stone she would use again before dawn. Children curled together beneath thin linen coverings while the smell of smoke and baked bread lingered in the warm air. Beyond the villages, the desert remained silent beneath the moonlight. Sand stretched endlessly westward, calm and empty, while the Nile Valley alone held water, crops, and life. Everything depended upon that narrow ribbon of green beside the river. Without it, there would be no grain. Without grain, no bread. Without bread, no survival for the countless ordinary people whose lives passed quietly beneath the rule of kings and temples. Hours slipped by slowly. Then somewhere near the edge of the village, a rooster cried into the darkness. Another day was beginning. Before the sun rose, the first workers were already awake. The coolness of the night still lingered faintly in the air as lamps flickered behind small windows and narrow doorways. Inside one crowded home, a young mother sat beside the grinding stone while the rest of her family still slept. Her movements were slow at first, her arms heavy with exhaustion carried from many previous days. But the grain had to be ground. The bread had to be made. There was no pause in these routines. The stone moved steadily beneath her hands. Grain cracked softly. Dust floated through the lamplight. Nearby, a clay jar stood against the wall containing only enough grain for a few more days. The woman glanced toward it more than once while working. Poor households often lived close to uncertainty. A delayed harvest. A weak Nile flood. Illness preventing work. Any small hardship could quickly threaten a family's food supply. For this reason, many Egyptians thought constantly about grain. They measured it carefully. Stored it carefully. Guarded it carefully from dampness, insects, and thieves. Grain meant safety. At least for a little while. Outside, the sky slowly shifted toward deep blue. A fisherman walked toward the river carrying a woven basket and rolled net over his shoulder. His sandals pressed into cool dust while stars faded overhead. The Nile at dawn carried a peaceful stillness unlike any other hour. Mist hovered above the water. Birds stirred among the reeds. The surface of the river reflected pale early light before the harsh brightness of day arrived. The fisherman stepped into his boat and pushed gently away from shore. The wood creaked softly beneath him. Water rippled outward in slow circles. He had known this river his entire life. As a child, he learned where fish gathered near the reeds. As a young man, he learned how currents changed during flood season. Now older, he carried those same lessons quietly within him each morning. Fishing demanded patience more than strength. Long hours passed in silence upon the water while the sun climbed higher overhead. Some mornings brought enough fish to feed the family well for several days. Other mornings brought disappointment. Still, the river remained essential to the poor. Fish offered nourishment different from grain alone. Even small catches mattered deeply. Back in the village, ovens glowed with firelight while bakers prepared the first loaves of the day. Heat rolled outward from clay ovens already hot enough to make the air shimmer. The smell of bread spread through the streets. Warm, heavy, comforting. Workers passing by often carried loaves wrapped carefully in cloth before beginning long days in the fields or workshops. Inside the home, the family finally gathered for the morning meal. The father sat cross-legged upon the floor beside his children while the mother divided bread carefully into equal pieces. A few onions rested in a clay bowl. Beer was poured into cups worn smooth from years of use. The meal was simple, but it would need to sustain them through many hours of labor. The father ate quietly, then stood and stepped outside into the cool morning light. Already the roads were filling with workers. Farmers walked toward the fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. Laborers headed toward construction sites and workshops. Servants moved quickly through the streets carrying baskets, jars, or bundles of reeds. The entire land slowly awakened beneath the rising sun. Near the fields, irrigation canals reflected golden morning light while farmers bent low beside young crops growing from the dark fertile soil left behind by the Nile floods. The work began early because the heat became unbearable later in the day. Men guided oxen through muddy earth while others repaired small canal walls by hand. Water had to flow carefully toward the crops. Too little meant weak harvests. Too much could damage roots. The Nile gave life, but people still had to labor constantly beside it. One farmer paused briefly beside a canal to drink from a clay jar of beer resting in the shade. The beer tasted thick and sour. Bits of grain floated near the surface. Yet it refreshed him enough to continue. Nearby, another worker chewed slowly on bread and garlic while sitting upon an overturned basket. The sounds around him remained calm. Water moving through the canal. Insects humming among the reeds. Distant voices carried softly across the fields. Then the men rose again and returned to work beneath the strengthening sun. As morning turned toward midday, the heat spread quickly across Egypt. The coolness of dawn disappeared completely. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Stone walls radiated warmth. The sky became pale with brightness. Workers narrowed their eyes against the glare while continuing their labor. In one crowded bakery inside the city, young workers carried trays of dough through clouds of flour dust while fires roared inside clay ovens. Their arms glistened with sweat. Ash stuck to their clothing. The room smelled of smoke, grain, and heat. Bread production never stopped for long because so many lives depended upon it. Nearby, brewers stirred fermenting grain mixtures inside enormous clay jars while flies buzzed lazily through the warm air. Beer too remained constant in Egyptian life. Workers received beer as payment. Families drank it daily. Children consumed watered versions during meals. For poor Egyptians, beer was not luxury. It was nourishment and routine. At the market, ordinary people moved carefully between stalls while merchants sold onions, beans, lentils, dates, fish, and rough loaves of bread. The market carried endless smells. Fish drying beneath the sun. Warm grain. Smoke. Animal dung. Dust drifting through crowded streets. A woman carrying a child paused beside a merchant selling dates. She counted small copper pieces slowly before purchasing only a few. Dates were sweet and filling, but not always affordable for poor families. Sometimes they became a rare comfort during difficult weeks. Nearby, an old man traded handmade baskets for beans and onions. He worked slowly now because age had weakened his legs, but he still needed food like everyone else. Even the elderly could rarely stop working entirely. As afternoon arrived, the streets and fields grew heavy with heat. Workers searched desperately for shade whenever possible. A group of laborers sat beneath a palm tree near a construction site while eating their midday meal. Bread broken apart by hand. Beans mashed with oil. Warm beer passed carefully between them. One younger laborer closed his eyes briefly while leaning against the tree trunk. His shoulders ached from carrying stone blocks since sunrise. The exhaustion of physical labor settled deeply into the body over time. Yet rest was always temporary. Soon the men stood again and returned to work. Inside homes, women continued preparing the evening meal despite the heat trapped within the mud brick walls. Lentils simmered slowly inside clay pots while children played sleepily nearby. The smell of cooking beans mixed with smoke and dust. One grandmother sat beside the doorway sorting onions while watching the street outside. Her fingers moved slowly now, stiff with age and years of work. She remembered flood seasons from long ago. Good harvests. Bad harvests. Years when grain jars stayed full. Years when families quietly worried through the night. Such memories lived inside older people like long shadows. At last evening approached. The sunlight softened across the Nile Valley. Palm shadows stretched across dusty roads. A breeze drifted gently from the river. Workers slowly began returning home. A fisherman carried several small fish wrapped in reeds. A farmer brushed dirt from his legs before entering the village. Children ran to greet tired parents returning from the fields. Cooking fires glowed once more across the settlement while smoke rose into the evening sky. Inside the homes, families gathered closely together around simple meals. Bread. Beans. Onions. Fish if fortune had been kind that day. The room glowed softly beneath oil lamplight while voices stayed low and calm. Outside, the Nile reflected the stars appearing one by one above the ancient land. And slowly, after another long day shaped by labor, heat, hunger, and simple food, poor Egyptians drifted once more toward sleep beside the quiet eternal river. The Nile flowed onward through the ancient darkness, calm and steady beneath the stars. Along the edges of the river, reeds swayed softly while insects hummed in the warm night air. The villages beside the water rested quietly, their narrow streets empty now except for the occasional wandering dog or the faint movement of someone still awake beside a dying fire. Inside the mud brick homes, tired families slept close together upon reed mats spread across hard floors. The air remained warm even deep into the night. Smoke from cooking fires still clung faintly to the walls and ceiling beams. Near one doorway, a clay bowl rested beside a loaf of leftover bread covered carefully with linen cloth. A few onions hung nearby from cords tied to the roof beams. In the corner stood grain jars holding the household's future meals, protected carefully from insects and dampness. These small stores of food carried deep importance. A household with grain felt safer. A household without it carried silent fear. In poor Egyptian homes, food was never taken for granted. Every loaf of bread represented hours of labor in the fields, at the grinding stones, beside the ovens, and under the relentless sun. The night passed slowly. Then, long before dawn, movement returned once again. Inside one small riverside house, an older man woke with stiffness in his back and legs. For several moments he remained lying still, listening to the familiar sounds around him. The soft breathing of sleeping children. The distant murmur of the Nile. The faint scrape of his wife already grinding grain beside the wall. He closed his eyes briefly again, wishing for a little more rest, but the day's labor waited ahead. Slowly he sat upright. His joints ached from years in the fields. Mud, heat, and hard work had shaped his body over decades until even standing required effort in the mornings. Still, there was no choice. The fields needed tending. The family needed bread. Outside, darkness still covered the village streets while faint stars shimmered above the river. A cool breeze drifted through the narrow lanes carrying the smell of damp reeds and smoke from newly lit ovens. Women throughout the village had already begun preparing dough. The grinding stones spoke softly inside countless homes. Stone against grain. Steady and endless. The work connected generations of women across the Nile Valley. Mothers taught daughters how to grind flour, knead dough, judge oven heat, and stretch meals carefully through difficult seasons. These lessons passed quietly through ordinary mornings. No written instructions. No ceremony. Only repetition and memory. Near the riverbank, fishermen untied boats from wooden posts while mist hovered above the dark water. One young fisherman rubbed sleep from his eyes before stepping carefully into his small wooden boat. He carried little with him. A net. A clay cup. Several pieces of coarse bread wrapped in cloth. Perhaps a few onions for later. The simplicity of the meal did not surprise him. It was the same food he had eaten nearly every day since childhood. The boat drifted outward slowly. Water lapped softly against the wood. Birds stirred among the reeds as dawn approached. For a brief time before sunrise, the world felt calm and almost cool. The Nile reflected pale silver light beneath the fading stars. Then the eastern horizon slowly brightened. Soon ovens glowed across the villages while smoke curled upward into the early morning sky. The smell of fresh bread spread through the streets, warm and familiar. Workers walking toward the fields often carried loaves tucked beneath their arms or wrapped carefully in linen. Bread remained the foundation of survival. Even poor families who owned almost nothing still tried to keep grain stored whenever possible. Clay jars filled with barley or emmer wheat represented security against hunger. Yet supplies could disappear quickly. A bad flood season. An illness preventing work. Too many mouths to feed. Any hardship could empty the grain jars faster than expected. One mother standing beside her oven quietly counted the remaining loaves after baking. She calculated in her mind how long they must last before more grain could be ground. Her children were growing. They ate more now than before. Still, the family would manage somehow. They always had. As sunrise spread golden light across the Nile Valley, workers filled the roads and pathways leading toward the fields. Sandals stirred pale dust while oxen pulled wooden plows beside irrigation canals. The dark fertile soil near the river smelled rich after watering. Crops stretched upward beneath the strengthening sun. Palm trees lined the canals where water moved steadily toward the fields. Farming demanded constant attention. Canal walls cracked and needed repair. Weeds spread quickly. Young plants required careful watering. A farmer's work rarely ended completely. Near one irrigation ditch, several laborers paused briefly to eat before continuing their morning tasks. Bread broken apart by hand. Garlic cloves. A handful of dates shared between them. Beer poured carefully from a clay jar. They sat in silence for a few moments beneath the shade of a palm tree while listening to insects humming near the water. Then one worker stood first. The others followed. And labor resumed beneath the growing heat. As morning advanced, the sun climbed higher and brighter above Egypt. The cool softness of dawn disappeared quickly. Heat spread across the fields and villages like a heavy blanket. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust clung to skin. The air itself seemed to slow. Workers in the fields bent low beside crops while boatmen rowed against river currents under the fierce light. Stone workers carried heavy blocks at construction sites where pale dust filled the air around them. Even inside workshops, heat remained difficult to escape. In one crowded brewery, workers stirred fermenting grain mixtures inside enormous clay jars while flies buzzed lazily nearby. The smell of wet grain and yeast filled the room. Beer production required large amounts of grain, but the drink itself was essential for ordinary life. Workers depended upon it. Families shared it daily. Laborers received beer as part of their wages. A man working in the brewery paused briefly to drink from a clay cup before wiping sweat from his face. His midday meal rested nearby upon a cloth. Bread. Onions. Beans mashed with oil. Nothing more. Yet the food would need to sustain him through many more hours of labor. At the marketplace, the streets grew crowded despite the heat. Merchants arranged vegetables, fish, and grain beneath woven coverings that offered narrow strips of shade. The smells drifted heavily through the air. Fresh bread. Fish drying beneath the sun. Animal dung. Dust. Smoke from cooking fires. A poor woman carrying a baby examined onions carefully before selecting only a few. Nearby, an elderly fisherman traded part of his catch for lentils and oil. Every purchase mattered. Food could not be wasted. One old laborer sat beside the market wall chewing slowly on dry bread softened in beer. His teeth had worn badly over the years from coarse bread filled with tiny stone fragments left behind during grinding. Many poor Egyptians suffered this problem. Their food sustained them, yet also slowly damaged their bodies. Still, survival mattered more than comfort. By afternoon, the heat became nearly unbearable. The roads shimmered beneath bright light while workers searched desperately for shade whenever possible. A group of farmers rested beside an irrigation canal while soaking cloth in cool water and placing it across their necks. One younger man leaned back against the earth and closed his eyes briefly. His body felt heavy with exhaustion. He had worked since before sunrise and still many hours remained before evening. Nearby, water flowed quietly through the canal toward thirsty fields. The sound was soft and calming. For a few moments, the workers simply listened. Then once more they rose and returned to labor. Back in the villages, evening meals slowly began taking shape inside the homes. Lentils simmered over cooking fires while women baked fresh bread for supper. The smell of warm grain drifted through narrow streets once again. Children played nearby while waiting for parents to return from the fields and workshops. The harsh sunlight finally softened toward gold. Long shadows stretched across the Nile Valley. A breeze arrived from the river carrying cooler air at last. Workers slowly made their way home. A fisherman returned with a modest catch wrapped in reeds. A laborer carried leftover bread from the day's work. A farmer walked with tired slow steps beside irrigation canals glowing orange beneath sunset light. Then night settled gently over the villages once more. Families gathered close together around simple meals while oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Bread dipped into lentils. Fish divided carefully among children. Beer poured quietly into worn clay cups. Outside, the Nile reflected the stars appearing above the ancient land. And after another long day shaped by hunger, labor, heat, and simple food, poor Egyptians slowly drifted once again toward deep exhausted sleep beside the eternal river. The warm night air drifted slowly across the Nile while the river moved in silence beneath a sky crowded with stars. Along the muddy banks, tall reeds bent gently in the darkness, whispering softly whenever the wind passed through them. The villages beside the water had become quiet again. Cooking fires had burned low. The smell of baked bread still lingered faintly in the narrow streets. Inside the mud brick homes, tired families rested close together after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. Some children slept deeply with empty clay cups still lying beside them. Fathers lay motionless upon reed mats, their arms sore from carrying tools, hauling grain, or rowing boats against the river current. Mothers slept lightly, never fully free from the thought of tomorrow's work waiting before dawn. The grain jars stood silently in the corners of the rooms. Always important. Always watched carefully. A family's future could be measured by the amount of grain remaining inside those jars. In one small home near the edge of a farming village, an elderly grandmother remained awake while the others slept. She sat beside the doorway listening to the sounds of the night. The river moving in the distance. An insect humming near the wall. A dog barking once somewhere far away. She held a small piece of leftover bread in her hands, breaking it slowly apart while thinking about earlier years. Years of strong Nile floods. Years of weak harvests. Years when grain was plentiful enough that children slept with full stomachs. And other years when families quietly stretched meals thinner and thinner while waiting for the next harvest season. She remembered how her own mother used to soften stale bread in beer for the younger children when food became scarce. She remembered neighbors trading fish for grain. She remembered the fear that settled over villages whenever the Nile failed to rise properly. For poor Egyptians, hunger was never a distant thought. It moved quietly beside daily life. At last the old woman lowered herself carefully onto the reed mat beside her family and closed her eyes. Outside, the Nile continued flowing through the darkness. Hours later, before dawn returned, the first movement stirred once more inside the villages. A woman woke while stars still shone above the river. The room around her remained dark except for faint moonlight entering through a narrow opening near the roof. Slowly she stood and crossed the floor toward the grain jars. Her feet made almost no sound against the packed earth. She reached into one jar and paused for a moment, feeling the amount remaining. Enough for now. Relief came quietly in small moments like this. Then she carried the grain toward the grinding stone. Soon the familiar sound began again. Stone against stone. Grain cracking softly beneath pressure. The rhythm was slow and patient. Many women spent years of their lives hearing little else before sunrise. Nearby, a child stirred in sleep while the smell of ash from yesterday's fire still lingered inside the room. The woman worked steadily while waiting for the first pale light of dawn to appear beyond the village. Outside, fishermen already walked toward the river carrying rolled nets over their shoulders. The air felt cooler during these hours before sunrise, and many workers treasured this brief softness before the heat returned. One fisherman stopped near the water's edge and looked quietly across the Nile. Mist hovered low above the surface. The stars reflected faintly in the dark water. Birds shifted among the reeds but had not yet begun their morning calls. The fisherman breathed slowly and stepped into his boat. Fishing often began before dawn because the river remained calmer and cooler in the early hours. Small wooden boats drifted quietly through the water while nets disappeared beneath the surface. The work demanded patience. Long stretches of silence passed while fishermen waited for movement in the nets. Sometimes the river offered enough fish to feed a household well for several days. Sometimes it offered very little. Still, the fishermen returned each morning because even a small catch could help a poor family survive. Fish added strength to meals otherwise built mostly from grain and vegetables. Fresh fish roasted above evening fires carried a smell that drifted through entire villages near the riverbanks. Salted fish stored for later use remained valuable during difficult seasons. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, ovens across the villages came alive once again. Bakers fed fires inside clay ovens while dough rested beneath cloth coverings nearby. Smoke drifted upward into the dawn air. The smell of baking bread followed soon after. Warm, rich, familiar. Children often woke to that smell before their eyes fully opened. Inside one small house, a young girl sat beside her mother helping shape dough into rough flat loaves. Her fingers pressed carefully into the soft grain mixture while her mother prepared the oven. She had already begun learning the household routines that would shape most of her life. How to grind grain. How to bake bread. How to stretch food across many days. How to recognize when a grain jar was becoming dangerously low. These lessons mattered more than almost anything else for poor families. Soon the roads beyond the villages filled with workers walking toward the fields beneath the growing morning light. Farmers carried wooden hoes and baskets. Oxen moved slowly beside irrigation canals. Dust rose softly beneath sandals. The Nile floodwaters had long ago retreated, leaving behind dark fertile earth stretching across the valley. Green crops grew where careful irrigation carried water through narrow channels cut into the soil. The work there remained endless. One farmer stood knee-deep in mud while repairing a damaged canal wall with his hands. Water flowed steadily beside him toward thirsty fields waiting beneath the strengthening sun. Nearby, another worker harvested onions while placing them carefully into woven baskets. Onions were among the most common foods in poor Egyptian households. Strong in flavor and easy to store, they appeared beside bread during many meals. Garlic too remained important. Simple foods. Strong foods. Foods that helped laborers endure long hours beneath the heat. As morning advanced, the cool air faded quickly. The Egyptian sun climbed higher, turning the fields bright and heavy with warmth. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Insects hummed loudly near standing water. Workers bent low over crops while trying to conserve their strength. At midday, several laborers rested briefly beneath a cluster of palm trees beside an irrigation canal. Their meal was modest. Bread wrapped in cloth. Beans mashed into a thick paste. Onions sliced thinly. Beer poured from a clay jar. One older worker softened hard bread in the beer before chewing slowly. Years of coarse grain had worn down many of his teeth, leaving eating difficult at times. Still, he finished every piece. Food could not be wasted. Nearby, younger workers sat quietly while listening to water moving through the canal and wind passing through the palms overhead. The shade offered temporary relief. Nothing more. Soon they would return to labor. Back inside the towns and cities, the marketplaces grew crowded beneath woven awnings. Merchants called softly while arranging vegetables, fish, grain, and pottery upon reed mats and wooden tables. The smells mixed together heavily in the warm air. Fresh bread. Dry fish. Dust. Animal dung. Smoke drifting from nearby ovens. A mother carrying a small child paused beside a merchant selling dates. She counted carefully before buying only a handful. Dates were sweet and filling, though not always affordable for poor households. Nearby, an old fisherman traded part of his catch for lentils and oil. His hands smelled strongly of river water and fish scales while he spoke quietly with the merchant. Food moved constantly through these markets. Bought, sold, traded, measured carefully. Everything depended upon harvests, flood seasons, and the strength of the workers themselves. Inside crowded workshops, labor continued despite the growing afternoon heat. Potters shaped clay beside blazing kilns while bakers pulled dark loaves from smoking ovens. A young bakery worker wiped sweat from his face using flour-covered hands before eating a quick meal beside the wall. Bread, garlic, beer warm from the heat. Simple again. Yet enough to continue. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, relief spread gently across the Nile Valley. Shadows grew longer. Wind from the river returned at last. Workers lifted tired heads toward the cooling air. One by one, they began walking home. A farmer carried leftover bread wrapped in linen. A fisherman balanced several fish inside a woven basket. Children waited beside village doorways watching the roads. Soon cooking fires glowed across the settlements once more. Lentils simmered inside clay pots. Fish roasted slowly over coals. Bread warmed beside the ovens. Families gathered together beneath the soft light of oil lamps while outside the Nile reflected the first stars appearing once again above the ancient land. And after another long day shaped by grain, labor, heat, hunger, and quiet endurance, poor Egyptians slowly drifted back toward sleep beside the eternal river that carried their lives forward through time. The Nile rested beneath the moonlight like a long ribbon of dark silver winding through the sleeping land. Along its banks, the reeds whispered softly in the warm night breeze while distant frogs called from hidden pools near the marshes. The villages had grown still. Only a few small lamps remained glowing behind narrow windows where someone had not yet fallen asleep. Most homes were quiet now, their mud brick walls holding the lingering warmth of the day. Inside these homes, ordinary Egyptians slept close together upon woven reed mats spread across packed earth floors. The rooms were small, and entire families often shared the same space. Clay jars lined the walls. Baskets hung from wooden pegs. A grinding stone rested silently near the hearth, waiting for morning. The smell of smoke still drifted through the air. So did the faint scent of bread baked earlier that evening. A young boy turned in his sleep beside his father, whose arms remained heavy with exhaustion from a long day in the fields. Nearby, his mother slept lightly with one hand resting near the grain jar, as though even in sleep she remained aware of the household's most precious supply. Grain was always close to the mind. Not gold. Not jewelry. Not luxury. For poor Egyptians, survival could often be measured simply by the amount of grain left in storage. A full jar meant a calmer mind. An empty jar meant worry entering the home like a silent visitor. Outside, the Nile flowed onward without pause. It had carried boats, fishermen, merchants, and farmers for countless generations already. It watered the crops, fed the fields, filled the canals, cooled the air during evening hours. The river shaped every meal eaten beside these village fires. Hours passed slowly beneath the stars. Then once again, before dawn, movement returned to the villages. The first sound was often the grinding stone. Inside one riverside home, a middle-aged woman knelt beside it while darkness still covered the sky outside. Her shoulders already ached before the day had fully begun. She poured grain carefully onto the flat stone surface and began the slow repetitive motion. Back and forth. Steady pressure. The sound filled the room softly while the rest of the family still slept nearby. This labor required patience more than speed. Fine flour took time to produce. The woman's hands moved with practiced rhythm learned from years of repetition. Dust rose gently around her fingers. Tiny fragments of stone mixed invisibly into the flour, as they often did in ancient Egypt. Over time these fragments wore down teeth across the population, especially among the poor who ate coarse bread every day of their lives. Yet such discomfort was accepted quietly. There was little choice. The bread still had to be made. Nearby, embers from last night's fire glowed faintly beneath ash. The woman leaned forward and carefully fed them dry reeds and small pieces of wood until a weak flame returned. Soon the room filled with the smell of smoke and warming grain. Outside, cool air drifted through the narrow village streets. A few figures moved silently in the darkness carrying water jars or bundles of kindling. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats beneath fading stars. One old fisherman untangled his net slowly while seated beside the water. His hands moved carefully despite stiffness in his fingers from age and years spent pulling wet ropes beneath the sun. The Nile before sunrise felt peaceful. Mist floated above the water. Birds rested quietly among the reeds. The river reflected pale moonlight mixed with the first faint signs of dawn. For a few moments, before labor fully returned, Egypt seemed calm and gentle. Then the eastern horizon slowly brightened. Bakers fed their ovens. Farmers gathered tools. Donkeys brayed softly in village courtyards. Children stirred awake beside the smell of fresh bread. Morning meals inside poor households remained simple and familiar. Bread torn into pieces by hand. Beer poured into clay cups. Onions or garlic shared between family members. Sometimes dates if they were available. Sometimes dried fish left from previous catches. The meals were not large, but they provided enough strength to begin the day. Inside one home, a father sat quietly while dipping bread into beer to soften it before eating. His youngest daughter leaned against him sleepily while chewing a small piece of onion. The room glowed softly with firelight. Outside, sunlight slowly touched the tops of the palm trees lining the canals. Soon the roads beyond the village filled with movement. Farmers walked toward the fields carrying wooden hoes over their shoulders. Laborers headed toward workshops and construction sites. Women crossed the streets balancing clay water jars carefully against their hips. Dust rose beneath every step. Near the irrigated fields, the dark fertile earth still held moisture from recent watering. Crops stretched toward the morning light while insects hummed near the canals. Farmers bent low beside the soil, clearing weeds and guiding water through narrow channels shaped by hand. The work demanded constant attention. Without irrigation, the fields would dry quickly beneath the Egyptian heat. Without successful harvests, hunger waited close behind. One young farmer worked beside his older brother while carrying baskets filled with onions freshly pulled from the earth. Dirt covered their hands and legs. Sweat already formed along their backs though the morning remained young. Nearby, oxen pulled a wooden plow slowly through the mud. The animals breathed heavily beneath the strengthening sun. At midday, workers gathered briefly beneath small patches of shade cast by palm trees or mud walls. Meals were eaten slowly and carefully. Bread wrapped in cloth. Beans mashed with oil. Garlic cloves peeled by hand. Beer shared from clay jars. One laborer lay back against the ground for a few moments after eating while staring toward the bright sky above him. His body felt heavy from exhaustion. He had worked this same land nearly every day since childhood. Still, tomorrow he would return again. Nearby, another man repaired worn leather sandals using thin strips of fiber while chewing slowly on dry bread. Nothing useful was thrown away easily in poor households. Sandals were repaired. Clothing was patched. Broken baskets were rewoven. Food scraps were reused whenever possible. Life depended upon careful preservation. As the afternoon heat grew stronger, the Nile Valley became bright and still. Air shimmered above the roads. Workers covered their heads with cloth while continuing their labor beneath the crushing sunlight. Inside workshops, conditions could become even more difficult. In one crowded bakery, heat from the clay ovens filled the room like a wall of fire. Young workers moved quickly carrying dough and fresh loaves through clouds of flour dust. Their faces shone with sweat. Their arms ached from lifting trays since before dawn. Still, bread production never stopped for long. Too many people depended upon it. Nearby, potters shaped wet clay while kilns roared with heat behind them. Brewers stirred fermenting grain mixtures inside giant jars while flies buzzed lazily overhead. The smell of grain and yeast drifted through the air. Beer remained central to daily survival. Workers drank it during meals. Children consumed watered forms. Laborers received it as part of their payment. For the poor, beer was nourishment more than pleasure. Back in the marketplace, merchants shaded themselves beneath woven coverings while customers moved slowly between crowded stalls. The smells mixed together thickly. Fresh bread. Fish drying in the sun. Dust. Smoke. Animal sweat. A poor woman carrying a basket stopped beside a merchant selling lentils. She measured carefully before purchasing only a small amount. Nearby, an old fisherman traded fish for onions and oil. Every transaction mattered. Every meal depended upon such exchanges. As the afternoon slowly faded, shadows lengthened across the Nile Valley. The fierce brightness softened into warm gold. Wind returned from the river carrying cooler air at last. Workers straightened their backs with relief. The hardest hours had passed. Farmers gathered tools before beginning the walk home. Fishermen returned with catches wrapped in reeds. Children waited eagerly near village entrances watching for familiar figures approaching through the dust. Soon evening fires appeared once again across the settlements. Smoke rose gently into the twilight sky. Inside the homes, lentils simmered quietly inside clay pots while bread warmed beside glowing coals. Families gathered close together beneath flickering oil lamps. The meals remained simple. Bread. Beans. Onions. Fish if the river had been generous that day. Yet after endless labor, even these modest meals carried comfort. Outside, the Nile reflected the first stars appearing above the ancient world. Voices softened. Lamps dimmed. And slowly, beside the eternal river, poor Egyptians drifted once more into deep exhausted sleep while tomorrow's grain waited silently inside the jars beside the wall. The night settled softly over the Nile Valley while the river moved through darkness with slow patient silence. Moonlight rested upon the water in trembling silver patterns that shifted gently beside the reeds lining the muddy banks. The villages slept quietly beneath the warm sky. From above, the mud brick homes looked small and crowded together, their flat roofs pale beneath the moonlight. Narrow pathways wound between them like dusty ribbons, now empty except for the occasional cat slipping silently through the shadows. Inside the homes, exhausted families rested after another day shaped by labor, heat, and simple meals. A fisherman slept beside folded nets still smelling faintly of river water. A farmer lay with aching legs stretched across a reed mat. A mother rested beside the clay oven where bread had baked earlier that evening. The rooms remained warm through much of the night. Mud brick walls held the day's heat long after sunset. Smoke from cooking fires lingered near the ceilings. The faint smell of onions, grain, and ash drifted through the air. In one small house near the edge of the village, a young child woke briefly during the night. He listened quietly to the distant sounds outside. The soft murmur of the Nile. Wind brushing against palm leaves. A donkey shifting somewhere nearby. Then sleep slowly carried him away again. The river continued flowing beside the dark land, as it had long before these villages existed and as it would long after their walls returned to dust. Hours passed. Then slowly, the darkness before dawn arrived once more. This hour belonged to workers. To bakers and fishermen. To women kneeling beside grinding stones. To laborers preparing themselves for another day beneath the sun. Inside one riverside home, a woman opened her eyes while the sky outside remained completely dark. Her body felt heavy with exhaustion, but she rose quietly so the children beside her could continue sleeping for a little while longer. She crossed the room toward the grain jar. Her fingers brushed against the cool clay surface before lifting the lid. The sound of grain shifting softly inside brought a small moment of relief. Enough remained for now. Carefully she carried a bowl of grain toward the grinding stone. Then the morning rhythm began again. Stone against stone. Slow pressure. Steady movement. The sound blended with many others rising across the village as women in neighboring homes began the same labor almost at the same moment. The grinding of grain formed the hidden heartbeat of Egyptian life. Without flour, there would be no bread. Without bread, laborers could not survive the long hot days ahead. Nearby, the woman's husband stirred awake slowly. His muscles already ached from the previous day in the fields. He sat upright and rubbed his hands across his face while listening to the familiar scraping sound beside him. Soon the smell of warming bread would fill the room. Outside, the air still felt cool for now. Fishermen walked quietly toward the river carrying nets and baskets over their shoulders. Their sandals pressed softly into the dust while stars shimmered above the Nile. The river at this hour looked calm and endless. Mist drifted low across the surface. Birds remained silent among the reeds. The water reflected pale moonlight mixed with the first faint blue tones of approaching dawn. One fisherman paused for a moment before climbing into his boat. He breathed slowly while looking across the quiet water. These brief peaceful moments before sunrise often felt precious. Soon the heat and labor of the day would return. Soon muscles would ache again. But for now, there was only the river, the breeze, and the silence. He pushed away from shore. The boat drifted gently into the darkness. Back inside the villages, ovens began glowing with firelight. Bakers fed dry reeds and wood into the flames while shaping rough loaves upon worn wooden boards. Smoke rose upward into the cool dawn air. Then came the smell. Fresh bread. Warm and earthy. The scent drifted through narrow streets and open courtyards, waking children before sunlight touched the rooftops. Inside one small house, a mother divided bread carefully between her family members while her youngest child watched sleepily beside the fire. The meal remained simple. Bread. Beer. A few onions sliced thinly. Perhaps dates if any remained from the market. The father ate quietly while preparing for the long walk toward the fields. He wrapped leftover bread in cloth for later and stepped outside just as the eastern horizon began glowing gold. Soon the roads filled with movement. Farmers carrying tools. Women balancing water jars. Laborers heading toward workshops and construction sites. Donkeys pulling carts loaded with grain sacks or pottery. Dust rose softly beneath sandals while the first sunlight spread across the Nile Valley. Near the fields, irrigation canals shimmered beneath the growing morning light. Water moved steadily through channels cut into the fertile dark earth. Farmers bent low beside young crops while guiding the flow carefully with wooden tools and mud barriers. The land near the Nile could appear beautiful during these early hours. Green fields, palm trees swaying gently, birds flying low over the water. But beneath the beauty existed endless labor. One young farmer stood knee-deep in mud repairing a damaged canal wall while sweat already formed across his forehead. Nearby, his older brother carried baskets filled with onions harvested earlier that morning. Their breakfast had been small. Only bread and beer. Yet they would work until evening. At midday, workers rested briefly wherever shade could be found. Beneath palm trees. Beside mud walls. Near irrigation ditches where cooler air lingered slightly above the water. Meals were eaten slowly. Bread torn apart by hand. Beans mashed into thick paste. Garlic and onions shared carefully. Beer passed from one worker to another in clay cups. One laborer softened stale bread inside his beer before chewing quietly while listening to insects humming around a canal. Nearby, another man stretched aching legs toward the shade while closing his eyes for a few moments. Exhaustion settled deeply into the body after years of physical labor beneath the Egyptian climate. Still, rest remained brief. Soon the men rose again and returned to work beneath the fierce afternoon sun. In the towns and cities, workshops filled with heat and smoke during the hottest hours of the day. Inside one bakery, workers moved quickly beside roaring ovens while flour dust covered their arms and faces. The room smelled strongly of grain, ash, and sweat. Bread production never truly stopped. Too many people depended upon it. Nearby, brewers stirred thick grain mixtures inside giant clay vessels while the sour smell of fermenting beer drifted through the building. Beer itself remained one of the most important parts of the poor Egyptian diet. It filled the stomach, provided nourishment, helped workers continue through exhausting days. At the marketplace, merchants shaded themselves beneath woven coverings while customers moved slowly through the crowded lanes. The smells there mixed heavily together. Fresh bread, fish drying in the heat, animal dung, dust, smoke from nearby ovens. A poor woman paused beside a stall selling lentils. She counted carefully before purchasing only enough for tonight's meal. Nearby, an elderly fisherman traded part of his catch for onions and oil. Food decisions shaped daily life constantly. Every family measured supplies carefully. Every grain mattered. As afternoon slowly softened into evening, the worst of the heat finally began to fade. Shadows stretched longer across the roads and fields. A breeze drifted once more from the Nile. Workers straightened tired backs and began their journeys home. Farmers carried tools over weary shoulders. Fishermen balanced baskets filled with modest catches. Children waited near village entrances, watching familiar figures approach through the golden dust. Soon cooking fires appeared across the settlements again. Smoke rose quietly into the evening sky. Inside the homes, lentils simmered inside blackened clay pots while bread warmed beside glowing coals. Families gathered together closely upon reed mats. The meals remained humble. Bread, beans, onions, fish if fortune allowed. Yet after endless hours beneath the sun, these simple foods brought comfort and relief. Outside, the Nile reflected the first stars of the night while reeds swayed softly beside the dark water. Voices faded slowly across the villages. Oil lamps dimmed one by one. And beside the eternal river, poor Egyptians drifted once more into sleep while tomorrow waited silently beyond the darkness, carrying the same ancient rhythm of grain, labor, heat, and bread. The night settled gently over the Nile one final time. The river moved slowly beneath the stars, calm and endless, carrying soft reflections of moonlight across the dark water. Reeds whispered quietly along the muddy banks while warm wind drifted through the sleeping villages. Inside the small mud brick homes, the fires had grown dim. Clay bowls rested empty beside the walls. The last pieces of bread had been wrapped carefully for morning. Families slept close together upon reed mats while the sounds of the ancient world slowly faded into silence. A fisherman rested beside folded nets that still smelled faintly of the river. A farmer slept deeply after long hours beneath the sun. A mother lay quietly beside the grinding stone that would wait patiently for dawn. The Nile continued flowing beside them all, just as it had for countless generations. Through seasons of flood and drought. Through years of hunger and harvest. Through quiet evenings filled with bread, onions, lentils, smoke, and tired conversation beside flickering lamps. The lives of poor Egyptians passed softly through the rhythm of simple things. Warm bread at sunrise. Dusty roads beneath tired sandals. Heavy afternoon heat resting over the fields. The gentle sound of water moving through irrigation canals. Evening meals shared slowly beside glowing coals. And finally, sleep beside the eternal river. Far above the valley, the stars watched silently over the dark land. Palm trees swayed softly in the night breeze. The last village voices disappeared one by one. Soon there was only the sound of the Nile. Slow. Steady. Peaceful. And somewhere beside the ancient water, beneath the warm Egyptian sky, the world drifted quietly into rest.